Welcome everyone to the 5th annual and first ever virtual Keenan Institute Frontiers of Entrepreneurship Conference. We're thrilled to have you with us, even without our usual draw of a winter hiatus down at the Breakers. I'm Greg Brown. I'm professor of finance at UNC Keenan Flagler Business School and executive director of the Frank Hawkins Keenan Institute of Private Enterprise. The Keenan Institute is proud to host this conference in partnership with UNC's Entrepreneurship Center, which is led by Vicki Gibbs. You'll be hearing from Vicki later in the conference. For those of you unfamiliar with the Keenan Institute and our work, we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan business think tank affiliated with UNC's Keenan Flagler Business School. Our core belief is that private enterprise is the cornerstone of a prosperous and free society, and we seek to foster the entrepreneurial spirit to stimulate economic prosperity and improve the lives of people around the world. We do this by leveraging cutting-edge research to develop and promote innovative market-based solutions to vital economic issues. And of course, following this past year's pandemic and the economic fallout, as well as the renewed calls for global and racial equity and justice, it's really my hope that this year's conference offers us all inspiration and insights for the ways in which entrepreneurship might drive our economy and our society forward. Before we kick things off, I want to thank those who have helped us get here. First, this conference couldn't happen without the amazing staff of the Keenan Institute, especially Sydney Bannerman, who is our events manager and tireless architect of this convening, but also Mackenzie Babb, our director of external affairs, and her team, Ashley Brown, our director of research services, and her team, and David Knowles, our director of business development, and his team. I also want to recognize our partner schools in this endeavor, of course, UNC Keenan Flagler, but also Duke's Innovation and Entrepreneurship, the Stanford Technology Ventures Program, UCLA Anderson School of Management, the University of Chicago Polsky Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation, the Wharton School, and the Yale School of Management. So finally, we're tremendously thankful for our sponsors, Ripple, the Small Business Investor Alliance, and VentureWell. As you know, in addition to kicking off our conference today, we're also releasing our 2021 Trends in Entrepreneurship report. This year's report maps really closely into the conference topics of capital access disparities, creating ecosystems where diverse entrepreneurs thrive, the burgeoning of entrepreneurship in healthcare, as well as entrepreneurial teams and talent. Creating the 2021 report has taken a lot of effort by the editorial team and staff. It was led by senior editors Sekou Burmis, Maka Mouine, and David Robinson, managing editors Ashley Brown and Vicki Gibbs, and also our associate editors Chris Bingham, Tom Byers, Chuck Easley, Kathy Eisenhart, Yale Huckberg, David Sue, Steve Kaplan, and Olive Sorensen. So we also benefited from the research support from the team here at the Keenan Institute, Sarah Kenyon, Bipul Katka, Juan Leanne, and Cecilia Poston, and copy edit and design support from Sue DiMaggio, Jack Walker, and Mackenzie Babb. The report has a ton of valuable information in it, some data, some never before seen data. So really encourage you to download the report and take a close look at it. The data partners for the report were Omni, the National Venture Capital Association, and the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission Office of the Advocate for Small Business Capital Formation. So you'll be hearing more about the report shortly. You can now download the full report or by section that corresponds with the conference. As many of you know, we launched the Trends report last year at the conference, really as a way of informing the content in the discussion sessions, and as well as staying up to date and connected through the year with quarterly special topics issues. This year, you're going to see an even tighter connection between the Trends report and our conference sessions. Going forward, we're going to continue to build on this format by really constructing the conference program around trends that are submitted by our community of academic, practitioner, and policy experts. We want to help you share your insights on current topics that are important to entrepreneurship and innovation. I'm excited to announce that we're planning to be back at the Breakers next year on January 27th and 28th, so mark your calendars. We're already preparing for next year's conference, and we invite you to send us your trends based on your research. People ask us all the time, how can they be assured of attending the conference? One great way is to submit a trend and have that accepted as part of the report. We'll be providing a complimentary registration for each accepted trend, as well as for the first time next year awarding prizes for the best submissions. So we'll be providing detailed information on submission in the coming weeks. So before I introduce our first speaker, a few housekeeping details. We have an excellent program lined up for the next 2 days, beginning with this morning's session on capital access disparities. After this session, we'll pause for a brief break, followed by our second session on diverse entrepreneurial ecosystems. Tomorrow morning, we'll resume at 11 o'clock Eastern Time for sessions on health analytics and entrepreneurship, as well as entrepreneurial teams and talent. Also, please note that we'll be recording the session, so you can access that content after the conference on the Keenan Institute website, keenaninstitute.edu/KIFE/2021. And finally, you can submit any questions that you have during the panel discussions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We'll work to answer as many of them as we can. And finally, we'll be gathering for informal networking sessions to continue the conversation from these panels today and tomorrow at 2 p.m. So be on the lookout for that if you're interested in having a live discussion with folks. Of course, you're always able to join the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag KIFE2021. And with that backdrop, I'm excited to turn things over to my friend and colleague, Olav Sorensen, to kick us off with an overview of our first trend and discussion topic, capital access disparities. Olav.
Sorry, let me just share my slides here. All right, hopefully everyone can see that now. All right, so thank you so much for the introduction, Greg. I'm looking forward to being back at the Breakers next year, but I think that we have a great set of participants and an interesting agenda for this year, so I'm looking forward to the conference. My role here is to really provide a little bit of data from the Trends in Entrepreneurship report that's relevant to this first session.
Olaf, we're seeing your notes, not your slides. So you've done something wrong with the sharing.
Sorry, thank you.
It wouldn't be an online conference if
exactly
wrong with
it didn't mess it up. Does it work now?
That's better.
All right, thank you. So, once again, I'd like to give you a bit of information from the Trends in Entrepreneurship report. If you read last year's report, you'll realize that what I've got here is a very small excerpt from the report. And in fact, this year's report has more than 60 plus pages just on the funding. So I'm just going to touch on some of the kind of main themes maybe in the report. So if we were sort of thinking about summarizing what we're seeing on the funding side, a lot of what we've seen in the press has really been about what has been called sometimes a K-shaped recovery. And we certainly see that playing out in public equities. The prices of tech companies have been soaring. Meanwhile, a lot of stocks related to more mainstream businesses have been either languishing or even declining over time. And in fact, what we're seeing in kind of small businesses and startups very much reflects, I would say, that same type of divergence. And so what I want to present here, I'm really thinking of in terms of, kind of what's good, the bad, and the ugly. And I'm going to start with kind of what's, I think, is the upside, maybe the kind of bright, light for the potential future, and then maybe become a little bit more pessimistic. So in terms of what's good, I think one of the really promising trends is looking at business formation rates. So this chart here is showing what has been the rate of business formation over the last roughly kind of 10 years. Actually, the horizontal axis on this is wrong. It should run from 2004 to 2020. I'm not sure why it has reformatted to this. But basically what we're seeing is the green here is showing the startup formation rate for sort of all startups. And you can think about a lot of the green are, kind of local services. What I think is even more interesting here is to look at the orange part of the chart. These are high potential businesses, ones that are likely to start having employees, not simply be self-employment or some sort of contractor. And what we're seeing is that there's a really market increase, although it's not as obvious from the vertical axis. There's a really market increase, not just in people working for themselves, but also in people starting businesses that are likely to employ others. And that I think bodes well for the future in the sense that these are likely to be the medium and even large businesses, maybe the Facebooks and Teslas of tomorrow. We also see a lot of room for optimism if we look at the venture capital side. So the venture capital is really, capturing probably the top, half of 1% of the highest potential businesses that are out there. And if we look at venture capital continues almost as though nothing has happened for the last year. If we looked at the number of deals or the number of companies being funded, we're continuing to see the same type of high rate of activity that we've seen for the last few years. In fact, funding dollars overall for 2020 even hit a new high. So from the venture capital world, we're seeing very much what we see in the public equity world, where there seems to be a lot of enthusiasm and tech businesses have been able to continue almost unimpeded by the crisis. And part of that is probably the fact that, a lot of these businesses had bit processes that were heavily based on online interaction already. And so it was not that difficult for them to kind of continue to produce, continue to develop their businesses by moving virtually, even if no one was coming into the office. Many of them were even helped as people were turning to these as substitutes for either in-person interaction or in-person shopping. But of course, that's the good side, and the downside, or the kind of the nature of the K-shaped recovery, is that there's also a number of businesses that are hurting. And so the bad here, I would say, is really thinking about Main Street. So we look at the Main Street businesses. This chart is focusing just on the last roughly 15 months and what's happened to the sales of those Main Street businesses over those 15 months. And what you see is that over essentially this entire time, Main Street businesses have been at least kind of 20 to 30% off of their normal sales levels. Interestingly, there's even disparities among these Main Street businesses in terms of where we're seeing the largest reductions in sales. So the green line on this chart is what the sales reductions have been in zip codes that have the lowest average incomes. Whereas the red line is what we're seeing for sales in zip codes with the highest average household incomes. And perhaps surprisingly, we're actually seeing that there's lower sales in the high income zip codes, or higher loss of sales in the high income zip codes than we're seeing in the lower income zip codes. It's probably a combination of factors that account for this. One is certainly that there's a little bit different mix of businesses. So more of the businesses that you see in high income neighborhoods tend to be businesses that are, let's say, less essential, easier services to forego. And so that has hurt those businesses more. There may also be some differences in the propensity for substitution. So higher income individuals may be more likely to substitute Amazon purchases, for example, than going to a store than you see in lower income neighborhoods. Now, as bad as all of this seems, it could have been worse. These are sales figures. These are not business closures. And one of the things that I think has and I think this will come out in the panel, that has probably reduced the number of business closures that we've seen is the Paycheck Protection Plan, which has actually allowed small businesses to get access to loans to help them maintain their businesses and employment. Now, This has certainly helped. And so we haven't seen the same number of closures that we probably would have seen in its absence. But I think one of the things that is perhaps worrisome here is, what happens when PPP ends? If you look at the, kind of the far right figure, the circle graph there, in the notes below that, it's talking about the proportion of businesses that are actually worried about having to close permanently. And 58% of small business owners said that they were worried about having to close permanently in the near future. Just to kind of, it's hard to kind of think about what that stat means, but imagine walking down your local downtown and having every other storefront, whether it's a shop or a restaurant, be empty. So, I think it's likely that we probably haven't seen the full extent of what the bad side in some sense of the last year has been. And that brings me to the last point, which is what I sort of think of as, I'm labeling the ugly. So, there's not just disparities between Sand Hill Road, if we're thinking about kind of high tech, and Main Street, or maybe if we're really going to be specific to Palo Alto, to University Avenue, since that's really the main street in Palo Alto. But there's also some real disparities within these groups. And part of the problem with, I think, what's been happening over the last year is that many of these existing disparities, the gaps are actually widening. So some of the stats that are relevant to this in the report, showing some interesting information, again, from the Office of Advocacy for Small Business Capital Formation. If we look at, sort of exactly which businesses are closing, we've seen a lot of closures overall. So overall, they're showing 22% of small businesses closing over the last year. Perhaps worryingly, the closures have been even larger among underrepresented groups. So 26% of businesses owned by women closed over the last year, and a somewhat staggering 41% of businesses owned by African Americans have closed over that same period. So, we already had a fairly wide wealth gap between African Americans and others, and that wealth gap, if anything, is likely to increase if we think that kind of small businesses are one road to narrowing the gap. And these disparities have really been increasing almost across the board in different ways. So we see it in the venture capital data. One of the things that, of course, has been a topic in previous discussions of the conference is that women receive much less venture capital funding than you would expect, certainly as a percentage of the population, but also probably as a percentage of even of high-tech entrepreneurs. There's been a lot of progress over the last few years, but if we look at the last year, we're actually now again seeing a widening of the gap with the number of, or the value of deals for businesses that are founded by women declining by 31%. So almost twice the decline seen overall in the terms of the number of startups. We're also seeing some disparities in the Main Street. PPE, one of the issues that I think will come out in the conversation is that the actual distribution of PPE funds has been mediated by banks, and there seems to have been some disparities in the allocation of that. One of these that I think is particularly interesting, but also discouraging is this Atkins et al. Study, which is mentioned, which found that Black-owned businesses received 50% smaller loans from PPP than similar, let's say, white-owned businesses. And one of the things that makes that, I think, particularly sort of important is that, they were very careful to try to look at observationally equivalent businesses. So the same types of businesses with, kind of similar types of, you might think, prospects, and yet the African-American owned businesses are receiving substantially smaller loans. So this is really just a very, kind of a quick, in some sense, teaser of what the report has for statistics. I do think there's hope for the future. In some sense, the business formation rate, I think particularly the formation of these high propensity, high growth businesses means that we're likely to see some really strong future companies emerge from this period. But at the same time, we probably still haven't seen the full extent of damage to some of the more mainstream small businesses and startups out there. And we're again seeing increasing issues of inequality. So with that, I would encourage you all to download and read the full version of the report, but I will turn it back to Greg and our panel.
Thank you so much, all. That was great. And we're now going to move into the panel discussion of this topic. I'd like to introduce David Robinson, who's going to moderate that conversation. David is the James and Gail Vander Weed Professor of Finance at Duke University's Fuqua School of Business. He's also a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research and leads the entrepreneurship efforts for the National Bureau of Economic Research. He's definitely an internationally recognized expert in the field of private equity, venture capital, and entrepreneurial finance, and the perfect person to lead this discussion. Turn it over to you now, David.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you for that introduction. I'm really happy to be here, and I'm really excited about this panel and the chance to hear from the three experts that we have. Olaf, thanks for that introduction. I think you did a wonderful job of teeing up a lot of the themes that we want to try to explore in our panel discussion today, which is entitled Capital Access Disparities. And just to tie back to what Olaf was saying, we're really here to discuss, in some sense, I'll borrow Olaf's language, the difference between Main Street and Sand Hill Road, or the difference between Main Street and University Avenue. And to do that, we've got three great panelists. I'm very pleased to, let me just introduce them quickly. I'm very pleased to share the panel with Yael Hochberg, who is a professor at Rice University and the person in charge of the Entrepreneurship Center at Rice. We're very happy to also have Steve Kaplan from the University of Chicago, also the faculty director of the Polsky Center for Entrepreneurship there. And then we also are very happy to be joined by Sandra Moore, who is managing director and chief impact officer at Advantage Capital. Before I dive into the questions, let me just set some ground rules. First of all, I'm really hoping to just be a funnel between the Q&A coming in from our huge number of participants we have on the call and these three experts. So I'm going to direct the conversation, but I'm going to be paying close attention to the Q&A window. If you have questions that you'd like us to discuss, by all means, type them in. And we've already gotten a great question from Mike Nerona that I'm going to try to pick up with shortly. Just type them in the Q&A window, and I will do my very best to incorporate them into the conversation. With that, let me just jump right in. And Sandra, I think I'd like to start with you, if you don't mind, because you're right there on the ground at impact level, dealing with companies who are trying to navigate their way through everything that we've been through over the last year. And so, let me go back to Olaf's points about the payroll protection plan, and maybe we can start there. What are your views about how effective this was in the segment of the market that you've seen? How do you see the portfolio companies you're dealing with? How have they responded to the crisis, and kind of what do you think we should do differently, and what lessons can we take away from what you're seeing?
Well, David, first of all, thanks for the introduction, and I'm very, very happy to be here. Let's do a sound check, make certain you hear me okay. And to answer your question, and I'm excited to answer it, but let me contextualize just a little bit so that our audience understands the vantage point from which I answer. And I am Chief Impact Officer at Advantage Capital. We're a venture capital firm, small business lender, and impact investor focused on growth. So we We've been around a very long time. We've got, 3.6 billion in assets under management at any moment, and about 200 companies, 230 that we're working with, 800 over the last 30 years, and they're small businesses. They are the quintessential companies that needed the support of PPP. So we saw, and we dug in with our companies and we did everything that we could to make certain that they had access, because as is pointed out in some of the early framing data, access was not equal and it was not easy. So that as an investor, we saw that as a real opportunity to step in and support. But it also gave us a very good view. And there was an upside and there was a downside. If we just looked at our own portfolio, what we can tell you is that PPP really put a floor underneath our portfolio companies and allowed all of them to hold on. And we were very, very pleased by that. We did not have a need to make any significant economic adjustments in order to help those companies. PPP did that. We did have to make some concessions on governance, and we believe that was probably an unintended consequence in the development of PPP. Some of the governance concerns that they required be mitigated in order for companies to qualify for PPP. We did that. And so again, really a floor and held our companies, and we found that to be very, very, very important. Now, the bigger question is looking forward, what is it going to take and what are we going to need to do in order to make certain that our companies can be held, many are recovering, and now we need them to grow. And that is the question, and many of my fellow panelists will help to opine on that. Let me just dig in on one little thing that I want you to pay attention to when you think about this growth after recovery and what kind of policy we are going to need in order to help that happen. Policies that will reduce disparity, important disparities. I'm going to look at one little piece. Let's talk about wages. Big disparity there across America, even and exacerbated in small businesses because they frequently may have the will to want to pay good wages and have good benefits, and they don't have the financial structuring to do so. Well, in this pandemic, what we've seen is that there, even for those companies with the will to support wage progression, wage growth year over year, advancement in wages for their workers, the pandemic threw a big wrench in that and it stalled it. So PPP allowed them to keep their employees on and keep them where they were, a very good thing. But how are they going to cover the ground that was lost in the last year and the wage ground that will be continually lost over the next year as we continue to recover? And what kind of policies can we put in place to support that? Or what kind of policies can we put in place for investors like Advantage to be able to support companies to get back into that tranche of wage progression being part of what the business looks at? It benefits the business, it benefits the workers, it is growth for the economy going forward, but we will definitely have to have policies to help cover the ground we lost and push us forward. I'll stop there for a minute.
So that's really interesting, because one of the things we've seen is huge numbers of people. Not only did we have a spike in unemployment, but we had huge numbers of people leave the labor force. That doesn't get counted in the unemployment statistics.
That's right.
People that are just home wishing things could be better. And so how do you think, I'm just curious, just picking up on what you just said there about wage dynamics, how are you thinking about the fact that there could be lots and lots of people sort of re-entering the labor force as employment conditions improve? That's not going to change the unemployment rate per se, but it is going to increase the workforce participation rate. How do you think that's going to play through in this wage story that you're laying out for us, where wage pressures are going to maybe make it harder for small and medium-sized businesses to grow? That seems like that might be something that dampens that concern a little bit, or how do you see it?
It is a good news and a bad news story. Deeper labor participation is important for
Yeah.
business growth, but it is also important for the kinds of things that I look at regularly, and that is social opportunity. The deeper we go into the labor pool, the more opportunities there are for people who have been disengaged from the workforce to become engaged. That is a very good thing, but that will in fact put additional pressure on this notion of wage progression, because the deeper we go into the labor pool, the more we are getting into people with lesser skills, lesser abilities. So it's a good news and a bad news story. We want to see broader and deeper labor participation rates. We want people back in the labor pool, but at the same time, which really supports my point, David, that there must be deep intentionality around something like wage progression.
Yeah, I see what you mean. I see what you mean. In terms of this spectrum between Main Street and Sand Hill Road, to lean on this this thing Olaf's given us even further, we've sort of started in the middle with you, Sandra, because of your focus sort of on growth capital. And you're talking about PPP being very successful for the portfolio companies you're looking at. You're probably looking at the top end of the spectrum in terms of the size of company that's applying for PPP and the kind of sophistication that they have in terms of internal controls and banking relationships and stuff like that. Before I turn and look at the extremes of the spectrum, I want to key back because I'm seeing some questions come in the Q&A window here that I want to address. I want to touch on your role as Chief Impact Officer, because we're seeing questions in the Q&A window about the importance of ESG considerations in entrepreneurship and gender considerations in entrepreneurship. And I'm wondering if you can just reflect on that from the vantage point of your role as Chief Impact Officer. What are you seeing in terms of how are ESG considerations that would have normally been front and center in some of your decisions? Are those being changed as a result of the pandemic and what we're seeing, or maybe you're emphasizing some things over others? Can you comment briefly on that?
Sure. So I'm going to answer in two tranches. I'm going to answer, and my role here as the Chief Investment Officer at Advantage Capital, where we are very focused, very laser focused on what our ESG outcome is, what we seek to achieve, and that is job creation, high wage, high benefit, rapid growth, job creation. That's the outcome that I am constantly monitoring. And then looking beneath that to see, and then what changes when you drive investment capital to achieve that impact outcome, what happens? And so the pandemic and the havoc wreaked by it has just sharpened our focus around that piece of work, and it will not change. How we raise the capital and what the return, that could be impacted by some of the other things that I've talked about already, and by what my panelists will share with you around how fast we can start to recover. Now, let me step outside of that role and say, as Chief Impact Officer, I also spend time looking at the ESG landscape, and what I am reading and picking up is that there's an intensified look at those outcomes, environment, social governance, intense from the investor's perspective. But what I find most interesting is that it's becoming more focused. One of the great challenges, I think, in impact investing has been that we have literally, in the investment community, been all over the map. You'd identify it, and somebody had a way to call it an impact that we were seeking. And now I do believe that the pandemic has caused us to draw in this country, to draw in and focus more on really what is it that we seek to achieve. We cannot rehang the moon every other day. We really do have to get some impacts that are real, that are measurable, and that we can have a flow through thread where we see the result.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you for that. Let me open it up to our other panelists, Yael and Steve, and just picking up on this thread that Sandra's laid out for us. How, if you think about venture capital more generally, our friend Paul Gompers has a paper with several colleagues called, I guess, venture capital's Me Too moment. And we're seeing a lot of changes inside venture capital organizations in terms of their composition and how that's impacting, in terms of how that's impacting how they're investing. I want to get your perspectives on this, and maybe I can get you to comment on this. Do you feel like we're seeing the kind of changes that we need in the composition of the investor base in order to continue to promote some of these ESG objectives and just sort of the gender parity and racial parity objectives that are implicit in that?
There's a lot to unpack there, and I think this is an ongoing process, right? One of the interesting thing about Paul's work, less about the Me Too hashtag, but putting that aside, one of the interesting things that Paul finds in that paper really is that the Ellen Pao trial led to more hiring of female partners at venture firms, and that the investment in female-led businesses went up as a result. But the really interesting piece of it is that it did not go up for the male partners. It goes up, the investments are coming from female investors in female-led businesses. And I think there is, this is maybe just a start in the direction, but there is a discussion to be had here around if we want to see more investment in, minority-led startups, in female-led startups. Is part of that about having, and part of the reason we haven't seen it as much, the fact that we don't have as many investors that come from communities of color or that come from that come from other, the other gender, and how much of this can we help accelerate by just sort of recognizing that, even if you sort of take bias out of the discussion, just the fact that sometimes, the types of businesses that women are leading, the types of businesses that underrepresented minorities are leading, are hitting target markets that your average male white investor just doesn't understand enough to really see the opportunities. And, will we see with more of this movement towards bringing in partners into the investment partnerships that come from different backgrounds, will we now see that trickle over into investment into founders that come from different backgrounds? And I think as you talk to many of the LPs, you're starting to see a push in that direction where LPs are starting to think about this as well. What does it mean to have an all white male partnership versus to have a little bit of diversity in that partnership, and what it means in terms of the potential for not missing out on opportunities, for having completely different networks to source deal flow from having completely different target markets to think about and to try and understand. So I think I think we need more of it. It's an ongoing process, but I think at least it looks like that process has begun, and the more conversation we have about it, hopefully the more it accelerates.
So, Yael, you're bringing up a really interesting point, and I think this is a point that's been too often overlooked in discussions about gender and racial parity inside investment organizations. And it's, we often hear about, the returns to investing in Black entrepreneurs are high. The returns to investing in female entrepreneurs are really high, and that should draw capital to them. And I think what gets lost in that is the fact that a Black investment committee probably has a better read on the value proposition of a Black entrepreneur than a white investment committee. And so their due diligence costs are lower. They're a better match. And so I think thinking through these processes in terms of thinking about the match between the investor and the entrepreneur, is going to change the way we think about the way these dynamics play out over time. I
mean, I think we see that even with just ethnicity in general, right? We've seen lots of research on, people of certain ethnic background investing in other people from their ethnic background, and how there's lower search costs, there's lower information costs, there's more soft information. So there are a lot of features like this, I think, that do play in exactly as you're suggesting.
Yeah, I want to try to cover this entire spectrum, running all the way from the smallest businesses, all the way to VC. But since we're on the point of VC, I want to stay here for a minute and try to pick up some more of these issues. Steve, I want to hear from you, and I'm particularly interested in hearing your reactions to some of what Olaf was talking to us about in terms of the it seems like VC dollars sort of hardly paused during this pandemic. And can you help unpack that for us a bit? I mean, are we just seeing dollars following on previous investments to support companies that already had an A round or a B round? Or, what are you seeing in terms of how capital is getting allocated as in the wake of the pandemic?
I mean, I think you're seeing all of the above. And so there was in Q2, there was sort of a stop on new deals. And so you saw very few. It started coming back in Q3. And actually, over the course of the year, the number of first-time VC investments in deals was about what it was in 2019. And that's extraordinary, because if you look at the other recessions we've had, the investing in early stage deals like dropped off the table. And they were kind of, they were, again, down in Q2 and a little Q3, but the end of the year, they were about the same. And then in terms of their existing companies, I did a survey with Ilya Strabalov, Will Gornall, and Paul Gompers over the summer of venture capital firms. And we asked them, A, were they going to invest in new deals? And they said yes, which they turned out to be telling the truth. And we also asked them what was happening with their portfolios. And this was in July, when there was still massive uncertainty. And they were pretty sanguine. It was shocking. They basically said 10% of their companies were really hurt. 40% were kind of, sick, but okay. And 50% were doing just fine, if not, really doing well. And so we concluded, venture capitalists will do fine. And then, of course, the equity markets took off in Q3 and Q4. And this is a golden age of venture capital. It's like stunning. The returns to VCs, I don't know if it's widely understood at this point, are the best they've been since, it's like, with the dot-com boom. And there are going to be a lot of people, putting up like awesome numbers when Q4 and Q1 21 come out.
So I want to dig deeper into this, Steve, because you're comparing what's happened in the pandemic and the pandemic-induced recession or related recession with previous recessions, but this recession is very different.
Yes,
and there were a ton of really interesting opportunities that were brought to the fore by the adjustments that we had to make in life in order to manage the pandemic.
The
right?
world went digital, and healthcare, was a hero, right? So
yeah,
those are the two things VCs invested.
Was the savior of humanity, and and we all got locked in our rooms watching Netflix all day. No, but in all seriousness, I feel like part of what the pandemic did that makes it very different from other recessions is it accelerated it accelerated changes that were already happening. It brought them forward in time, and that created excess demand for capital that might have played out over a number of years. How much of what you were seeing in Q3 and was the inevitable response to that, or do you think that it was capital that was being deployed kind of beyond what I'll call pandemic shockwave investment?
You never know, right? It's very hard to predict while you're in it, because 1998 investments were great, right? In the middle of the dot-com boom. 99 and 2000 investments not. So are we in 1997, 98 now, or are we in 99, 2000? And my sense is Q3, and Q4, the investments were probably good. And now, you get a sense there's a bit of a, once people have seen these returns, people have this money, and there's a bit of a frenzy. I think it was the Journal today had an article about deal frenzy on the venture side. And
for a second, Steve.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, there you go. You came back. It may have been
that deal. That's odd. I'm in my office. It should be good internet. There's an article in the Wall Street Journal about deal frenzy today. So in Silicon Valley. So has it gone, too far? We'll see. We don't know.
Well, that's exactly the question I was going to follow up with, because if you think about what happened in the late 1990s, we had, some people might argue overinvestment, that, but a lot of that overinvestment laid the foundations for the next wave of internet use that we had. And, all that dark fiber that got laid in 2000, 2001 gave us, streaming video and, everything else. Are we in that same world now? And Yael, Sandra, please jump in here as well. This is actually not an interview.
I'll just make an observation as well, which is that the kinds of companies that venture is investing in to a great extent are the kinds of companies where business can continue remotely, where the fact that we've moved to this digital world where we're on Zoom and people are working from home and teams have to kind of figure out how to coordinate remotely and make things work. You can't do that with a lot of the small Main Street businesses right? But you can do that with a lot of the technology businesses and more generally with innovation-driven businesses. And on top of that, a lot of those goods and services are sold digitally as well. They transition to the internet, which means that in a very real way, while there's sort of a pause while we figure out what's going on, as you progressed further into the pandemic, there's sort of this realization that actually everything can sort of go on roughly as, in a new normal, but those businesses
can. For some people, not everyone.
Not all of them, which is why, you're going to see that 10% or the 20% that are not going to manage. But I think for a large part, there are investment opportunities out there in many ways for venture that, aren't nearly as affected by what's going on here. And that a lot of the recession piece is coming with the things that do actually involve, it's restaurants, it's small businesses where people actually do have to show up in person, and where they can't sort of substitute with a lot of the digital aspects that many technology companies have.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about how Main Street is accessible to the whole world through the digital sort of digital sales channels. You can visit any Main Street you want, and that certainly changes this dichotomy and makes it much richer.
Well, but I was saying it's for the consumer side. This is it's the well-off people who do well on this and can access it, and the people at the lower end have it's harder. I think again, some of the stimulus money really helped there to keep people with money, and it'll be very interesting to see going forward what happens on employment. Going back to what Sandra was saying earlier. Although the thing that people maybe forget.
Steve, my audio on you is dropping out again. I may be the only.
Is it me or is it you? Can you hear me? Sandra, can you hear me?
I can hear Steve.
Good.
David, your audio dropped out a little.
It's on me. Sorry, guys. I'll be quiet.
I can hear both of you, but David, you are dropping in and out.
Okay. I'm at the University of Chicago. We have good internet. So I was saying in Q4 2019, the employment numbers were terrific, and in fact the income inequality numbers were good too. The over the sort of 3-year period or previous 4 years, the lower income people actually did pretty well, and everybody did well because the economy was good, but the income inequality numbers were getting better. Employment was terrific, and I won't channel our former president on that, but that there's some truth to the fact that things were good, and then the pandemic just completely crushed everything, and particularly on the lower end. And so now the question is, how do you get out of it? And we'll see. And it has gone more digital, and where are jobs going to come from? And we don't know. I tend to like markets and trust them, so I'm cautiously optimistic, but we'll see.
Yeah. Sandra, right?
Both Steve and Yael have said all that I would say, but I really, in facing forward as an investor and talking right now with potential LPs about ways to target investing to get the outcomes that we seek. More jobs in places where real people can work them. Because you know that these or mid-level companies rather are the ones that drive job creation from the ground up. So we need both things. We need the innovation that VC capitalists can run to right now, and there are lots of it, but we also need the investment from the bottom up in order to get to balance and reasonable healthiness in our economy. So in looking forward, I think the most important thing is focus with intentionality around these challenges. That's what I think is the great benefit of this Me Too moment that exists, not just in looking at what's happening with investors, but also looking at how investors are behaving in relationship to what they want from the rest to happen in the rest of the economy.
That's a really great point, Sandra. We've got a really interesting question from Bobby Franklin at NBCA. But before I put his question out to everyone, I want to stay on this point that you've raised, Sandra, because first of all, I think it's incredibly important that we focus this conversation on looking forward over the next 18 months rather than looking in the rearview mirror. But we talk about the world changing and it becoming much more acceptable for work from home is taking off. And we talk about, you've stressed, Sandra, the importance of wages and of creating good jobs. And then lurking in the background is this discussion about equity and underserved, underappreciated communities. Changes in real estate really have some knock-on effects here. If you think about the fact that pushing everyone out of the workplace and working from home, that's changed the demand for household amenities. It's easy to work from home if you've got a home office with high-speed internet. Yeah. It's not as easy to work from home if you don't have high-speed internet, don't have a home office. You got to manage childcare, things like that. So I think there's a real possibility that if we don't act with intentionality here, that we're going to exacerbate many of the underlying trends just because we're relying. So we'll be relying that much more on household amenities where we already know that there are big disparities. I'm wondering, how are you thinking about that? And
so, David, let me just say one thing.
Yes, going forward from here.
Let me just say one thing quickly, and I'll get out the way for my co-panelists on this point. See, I'm with Steve. I believe in the market.
Yeah,
I really do. When I came to this work from the not-for-profit world, when I decided that the only way that the changes that I really cared about, the social and economic gaps that I wanted to see closed, when I came to the realization they would only be closed by private sector investment, appropriately driven. So I believe in the market. And that's where I think the enormity of opportunity is, and why I dwell on intentionality in both policy and as a practitioner. I ride my own partners. It's not hard because they agree with me on intentionality, because we can figure out, the market can figure out and invest in how to make certain that we create accessible pockets of internet of high quality for the communities that can't get it like you and I get it.
And I think you're going to see, certainly everything I see, there's a lot of demand from investors to give money to people who are going to invest in those areas where there's women or underrepresented groups. And that's going to be a really good experiment to run because we're going to see, are the returns there or not? And I sure hope they are. Because that'd be a really good outcome. But if they're not, we'll learn something too. And so it's an experiment that is about to be run because there's a lot of demand for that, and it'll be very interesting to see what happens.
Yeah, I agree. You're not going to get a lot of pushback from me, by the way, Sandra, on the markets being the best solution available here. I'm not going to fight you on that one. I've got a ton of questions coming in through the Q&A window, and they're great questions. And so I want to try to give voice to all of them. But I'm probably going to take them out of order because I'm trying to blend the themes together. Michael Chow is asking about Olaf's chart showing the business closures by race of owner and how striking that was. We saw a much bigger drop in the Black community than in the white community. And so how do you think going forward about how we level the playing field with respect to access to government capital, other forms of support? And I guess, there's probably a role for innovation in fintech and things like that to play in this. And so I want to hear from everybody.
Yeah, I mean, I think, one of the things to recognize is that the way we distributed PPP had big effects on who got access and who didn't. The fact that we went through the banks, the fact that for the banks, it was easiest to effectively distribute this money to companies with which they had pre-existing relationships where they sort of understood what they were dealing with. And the fact that, I think there are probably more minority-owned businesses that, just sort of lacked that pre-existing relationship banking with the banks that had, the most PPP money to distribute. And that's part of what we're seeing playing out. And until there were some structural changes in the PPP, that's sort of how it was playing out in the field. But I think that means that we have to start thinking about, what does, how do these funds, whether it's, another injection of capital similar to the PPP, or how we think about SBA backed loans and so forth, how do we distribute this, and what can we be doing in terms of design of the mechanisms to make sure that we are actually being intentional about things and that we are being fair about things? And I think there's a little too often we sort of just point at the infrastructure that we have and say, we'll just use this, and, ignore the fact that a lot of what has been, built up, not necessarily intentionally over time, but just the way it's evolved, turns into systems that, give access to particular groups and deny access to others. And that, I think this just sort of brings back to the intentionality piece.
Let me give a quick example. So the banking partner with that we work most closely with for our portfolio companies has given us some feedback. And what they told us is that the second round of PPP did a much better job addressing the smaller guys and gals in business. What did they do? And consequently, did a much better job with minorities and the underserved populations. What did they do? They turned to 1099s as opposed to some of the financials that were required in the first round. What else did they do? People were able to apply for themselves. And something so simple as being able to stop and start in the application process was built into the system. And there were other things. They started using social security numbers instead of EINs, which a lot of sole proprietors didn't have EINs. Now, right. So there are now we've got really hard data on how much that can change and how it can drive the outcome that we want deeper to get the PPP resources, stabilizing resources to the companies that need them most. But like everything in life, it's a series of trade-offs, because that also opens up the door for potential for more fraud.
Yeah, that's right.
And you ask our banking partner and they say, we've got our eyes closed, Sandy, and our fingers crossed that 2 years from now, we're not getting audited and all of us and our children are being sent to jail. So it's a constant balancing act that has to happen even with intentionality. And I think sharing information in forms like this really helps. So people understand it is not always a binary choice.
To exactly this point about the travails of extending these PPP loans to very, very small businesses, I think it's important to bear in mind that we hear about there being 30 million small businesses in the U.S. And the number that people forget about when they hear that is that about 24 million of those small businesses have 0 employees. And so that means that for about 5/6 of the population that you're intending to treat with PPP, a direct deposit into a bank account is a perfect substitute for the economic impact of it, right? A perfect substitute. And so I think we've spent, I'm not trying to sound overly critical of PPP, because I understand that a lot of it was developed on the fly in the heat of the moment, and we did the best we could with the tools that we had. But I think that I think that a lot of the problems that you're speaking to in that comment would have naturally gone away if we'd had a heightened appreciation for just how much of small business activity is solo entrepreneur activity. And in that world, you can reach that audience much more easily and much more directly by cutting out the banks as the middleman and just going straight into the household bank account, as we have with the stimulus checks that people receive. So we know how to do that. We know how to make a direct deposit into a bank account, and we could have done more of that. Anyway, I think too often that fact gets overlooked. Let me turn back to some questions that are coming into the Q&A panel here, and I want to go back to go back to the subject of VCs, because a lot of the discussions that we've been having here, a lot of the changes in behavior that we're seeing in VCs are at some level coming from LPs pushing them to behave differently. And so Bobby Franklin has an interesting question here, that at the NVCA, they're observing that the sort of investment tourists that step into venture capital over the last few years seems to be going down. And I'm curious to hear, sort of both from the academic perspective and from the practitioner perspective, are you seeing kind of a change, are you seeing changes on that front? And what do you think trends are going to look like going forward in terms of there being a more heterogeneity in the types of people who are trying to get into venture? This is something that we've seen in past spikes where, when the market goes up, it pulls in a lot of new money into venture capital, some of which is not terribly well suited to ride out the bumps along the way. What are you guys seeing there, and how do you think this is going to play out over the next 18 months, 24 months, as invariably some things start to shake out?
So, I mean, I think part of what Bobby's pointing at, it's, and I know his question also was asking a little bit about, how do we think about this as the private versus public markets debate, and some of what we've been seeing with the changes and who goes public. I think there is a definite shift that has happened in terms of what kinds of companies really can be supported by the public market, want to be supported by the public market, are going to be accepted by retail investors, which has led to an explosion of private capital investing in companies. And I'm not saying it's bad or it's good. I think we don't, necessarily, I don't know that we have the research to necessarily stand behind any of it. But I do think that, when you start talking about companies raising the kind of money they used to raise on public markets in private markets, that does mean that it's going to require a different kind of investor to step in, and that we're going to see new classes of investors who are stepping in to fill those gaps. I think even before that shift happened, the retail investor was falling off on Wall Street, right? We were into big institutions. Maybe it's not too surprising that now those institutions are doing this just without the burdens and the scrutiny of the public market. I don't know that we're necessarily going to see. I think some of these groups that we thought were tourists are not tourists. This is a real new investment class. Steve and Sandra may have different thoughts on that.
I think what Bobby is referring to is first-time funds in the NVCA database are down, and the investment is up in general. So it's the existing folks who are there raising the money, and I think there's some truth to that on the institutional side. Let me just go back though. I'm going to go back to 2010 to 2015 and then come to today. 2010 to 2015. Actually, the money going to venture was quite low. And when people asked me, where should I allocate my money, which asset class, I said, I would overweight venture. And, occasionally I'm right about predictions. That one I was very right. And now, the amount of money in ventures has flowed in. More is going to flow in this year because the returns are awesome. I think you will see more tourists because everybody wants into venture, and this is what happened in 99 and 2000. You also see, and I'm guessing this is not in the NVCA data, there are a lot of sort of smaller funds that are not institutional that are out there investing. And I've got I probably have 5 or 10 former students who have such funds, and that's, so you got to multiply that by a lot, and some of those are going to do well, and then they're going to become institutional funds, and some of them are a couple of those are women founders. So which is the group that the Gompers Want paper wrote about. So I think you're going to see money coming in. You're going to see it go to different groups. The bigger existing groups get more of it, but there'll be things happening, I think.
Sandra, did you want to add?
No, I won't, other than to say I want both things to be true.
Yeah.
So David, one thing I will add is that I think to the extent that we do want to see more of these new investment groups, to the extent that we don't want this market to become merely large chunks of growth capital, and that we want more seed funds and so forth, there are a lot, going back to the intentionality point, there's a lot of things we do actually have to start thinking about. And that's, as we start thinking about implementing, potentially new tax changes and so forth, there are going to be a lot of things that are potentially going to affect the ability of particularly the smaller funds to be financially viable. And I think a part of the intentionality piece is understanding that when we make changes that we think are meant to address societal ills at the top end, we're going to have to start thinking very carefully about what the implications are at the bottom end, and how that is going to affect the smaller funds that really serve the middle of America and that serve the minority communities. I think we actually want, I don't think we want tourists, but we definitely want more of that. We want more experiments, and we want more first-time funds. So
you want new travelers.
Yeah, that's right.
New travelers. I like that. Exactly.
And that is what I so facetiously meant when I said we want both things to happen.
Yeah. Well, so this is a perfect lead into to a question here by Vicki Gibbs at UNC. How can new funds coming into VC, these new travelers, if you will, or innovators, how can they help address disparities in how venture capital is dispersed to underrepresented groups? And what advice would you have to investors who are considering going into that space now?
Sandra, were you about to say something?
No, go ahead. That is a very tough question, but go ahead. Yeah, you go first.
I was going to say, I think, where if you are interested in this, I think there's opportunity to be found. It's opportunity to be found outside of the traditional hubs and in areas that I think just haven't had people looking at them and haven't had people scrutinizing them. It's going to need support, and we probably should be trying to generate more of those companies to begin with in those areas. But I think, the groups that, particularly the communities that are outside of Silicon Valley, they're outside of New York, LA, et cetera, who are, which is I think where there's a lot of opportunity for precisely, these kinds of ventures to start up. They are, that's going to be places where you want the smaller funds and the newer funds. That's where these funds need to be playing. And I think if you're just another fund coming into Silicon Valley, that's going to be a very different story. But if you want to be intentional about things, you need to be looking at other types of communities, and you need to be looking outside the hubs. And I do think that the pandemic and the digital transformation is going to help that a lot. I think it's brought down a lot of the barriers, that people were sort of like, I don't want to get on a plane, I'm not going to look at these cities in middle America. I do think that now there's a greater willingness and a greater ability for people to sit on the coasts and say, yes, but I can still invest in the Midwest. I can still invest in the South, and so forth. So it's going to be interesting.
So the reason I say this is such a tough question is I agree with everything that you just said, Gail, but the elephant that is in the room that hasn't been stated is that there also has to be some adjustment of expectations on return.
Yes. Yeah, the returns are going to be different, right? But
that there has to be some new appreciation of the pricing of risk.
Yeah. So this is exactly what I was going to say, Sandra. We talked about the returns being different. Everybody focuses on returns, but the other half of returns is risk. And
That's
so,
correct.
I mean, we may be in a situation where we have a more favorable risk return trade-off, especially in the context of a broader portfolio, even if the headline return number is, let's just go ahead and say it, lower.
But I'm seeing more and more of this where I have former students coming to me or raising funds where the premise is not I'm looking for $1 billion exits. The premise is I get into companies that are going to require much less capital in order to reach a $50 million exit. And I can make great returns off of that. And I can build companies that will employ many, many people and that will provide fantastic exits for the founders, meaningful exits for the founders. And they don't have to be multi-billion dollar companies, right? They are companies that are providing real goods, real services where, you start thinking about going in you start thinking about how I deploy in total 2 to 5 million, not 20 to 500 million, right? And that's a different game to be playing in, but I think more and more of the smaller funds are realizing that there is an opportunity to make good returns there with a very different return, very different risk reward kind of viewpoint than what you're thinking about when you're investing a $1 billion fund it's sitting out of the Bay Area.
Go ahead, Steve.
No, that's the question I said earlier. There, LPs are interested in funding these kinds of investments now, I think, more than they used to be. And some will call them impact, some won't. But then you're going to run that experiment and see if the returns are there. And that's the big question. And we'll let's hope they're there. We'll see.
Steve, you'll run the experiment and see if the returns are there. And if the returns are not there, if there is the appetite to stay in the space for less returns, or what concessions are LPs willing to make in exchange for returns. I mean, this is a big area.
That's a big question too. And that's the private sector people, I don't think are going to have an appetite for it, and whether the public investors do or not, that's it's a political issue, I think, but that's,
So LPs have to be willing to put their money behind these things as well. And I think that is one of that's one of the issues is just sort of, are the LPs going to be willing to experiment? And how do you handle the fact that in many cases, the big institutional LPs want to write much, much bigger checks. And if you're talking about raising a $50 million fund, that if they can't put 20 million in, that's a problem. Where is that money going to come from? But, I think, that's an area that we're again going to need some experimentation with.
So I'm mindful of our time, and we've only got a little over 5 minutes before we need to conclude. And before I do that, though, I just want to build on this point that you've been making, Yael, and implicit in what you've been saying, is that when we talk about diversity, especially now with the out-migration from cities that we're seeing in the midst of the pandemic, geographic diversity in investment is an important issue here, and sort of geographic changes in the locus of entrepreneurial activity, I think, is something that's going to be important going forward. And I just want to give just a few brief minutes to that before we wrap up. How do you guys see? I mean, I guess it's sort of implicit in some of what you've already said in terms of smaller funds being able to operate creatively in some of these smaller markets. But what do you see looking ahead in terms of new locuses of entrepreneurial activity, and how is this going to change sort of the broader dynamics that we're used to thinking about in this market?
There's certainly, and Sandy is probably in the position to talk more about this, but at least the VCs I talk to, they're more comfortable doing deals in non-standard geographies, and they'll, particularly with Zoom, they can do a lot of stuff.
How much of it is just us getting comfortable with Zoom? We can suddenly
it's a big chunk, and also I think talent is distributed more broadly than just a few places, and I think that's going to be a reality.
So it has been our business model and our success foundation that we're willing to go where the capital won't, and we will continue that. And we do see that particularly in the smaller firms. They're starting to run to the Midwest. They're starting to run to the upper Midwest. As we speak, I'm sitting right here in St. Louis, and St. Louis has become quite a little hotbed for startups. And we are beginning to see through a 10-year effort, companies, startups moving here because they will get the broad base of support that they need and capital to really grow. So I think this world is changing dramatically. And I think that this pandemic, it's one of the upsides of it. We've all had to figure out how to invest in something that maybe you haven't seen other than on television. But we are figuring it out. You tell us, Steve, we're doing better than we ever have. So we figured it out. We are in a period of big transition. I want it to happen. However, I love keeping our competitive advantage because we've been doing it a long time. We are all across the country. So come join us.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I point at Chicago and a lot of the efforts that Steve's been engaged with as well in the last 10 years as proof that you can build an ecosystem, right? That you really can take ecosystems and accelerate them and put that kink in the curve that really makes a difference. And we're putting a lot of the same sorts of efforts that Chicago put in 5-10 years ago here in Houston with the same sort of idea in mind. And there are many cities in in the Midwest and that have tremendously diverse populations where there's tremendous talent that's just hidden and that doesn't even realize that these are opportunities for them. And I think that stepping back for us to think about things around entrepreneurship education and and how we do that at universities, not just at the MITs and Stanfords of the world, but at the HBCUs and the MSIs and all of our big state institutions, and thinking about how we support more of the translational research that takes the basic science out of the universities, tremendous research universities in the middle of the country, where we're really not utilizing much of what we fund with federal research dollars, but really could. And things, I think there are investments we can make that will be transformational as well in creating those companies that capital like Sandra's and capital from the coast is going to come in and absolutely fund.
Let me say one more thing very quickly. We also have been pushing into investing in rural, ex-urban and rural areas in the country. And I think that as the pandemic has taught us that we can live in less congested urban areas and we can thrive in suburban, ex-urban and rural areas, you're going to see more capital being driven into those geographies. And when the capital goes there, you see the result.
Everything it follows, yeah. So we're almost at time, and I need to be mindful of our time here. So I'm going to just throw out one final question, and this is going to be a lightning round speed question. I'm going to put each of you on the spot. But a big part of what we're trying to do at the Frontiers of Entrepreneurship Conference is set the stage for future research. And so I want to close by just you can just throw out a one-word answer if you want, but what are the topics or projects where you think we need new research, and what questions should we be asking now in order to have answers at the ready, looking ahead? It can be high-level topic, it can be question on your mind. Where should we be directing our research efforts?
I'll start that. So I want to go to something Sandra said about measuring how she measures impact. And I love that she said job creation, because you can measure that.
Yeah.
And I think you want to figure out, how do you measure impact and which impact is most value accretive if you're thinking about your LPs. And my guess is job creation is very correlated with creating value. So that's a good one, but it'd be nice to know. And then other pieces of ESG that people care about, whether it's diverse workforces or environmental, are those, how do you measure it? Yeah, and then what's correlated with value? Because if you can find, those impacts that are socially desirable and value accretive, that's what you want.
Yeah, great. Yael, Sandra?
I'll go. I want to understand, get some research done on what concessions will actually stand out. What is it that LPs are willing to concede on in exchange for what?
I see. And that ties closely to what Steve's saying.
That's right.
Yeah, it's
Let's,
different.
let's understand that.
Yeah, it's related. Yeah.
I think from my perspective, I'd also like to see more research around the actual cost benefit analysis around the kinds of interventions that we use to build ecosystems and where is it best for us to be putting our dollars, not just what works, but what works best and how things work in concert.
Awesome. What a wonderful panel. Thank you all. Thank you, Sandra. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Yael. Really enjoyed this conversation. And I want to thank everyone on the call for your attention and for your questions. We're going to take a quick break now, but we hope that you'll join us back here at 12:40 Eastern time. So in 20 minutes time from now for our next session, which is entitled Creating Ecosystems Where Diverse Groups of Entrepreneurs Thrive. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the afternoon session today for the Frontiers of Entrepreneurship Conference. Hopefully y'all got to see the session before and you saw Greg kick off. This is our 5th annual conference. It is our first ever virtual conference. And as a result, it is our largest. So really excited to welcome y'all here today. So I'm Vicki Gibbs. I am the Executive Director for the Entrepreneurship Center at UNC Kenan-Flagler. And we are very excited to partner with Greg and the Kenan Institute on the Frontiers Conference and also the Trends Report. Now, I personally am really excited that we are seeing a tighter integration of the report and the conference this year, and really interested to see how this all works out, and really interested in y'all's feedback as well afterwards. So please let us know that. Now, the session this afternoon is a subject that I personally am very passionate about. It is creating inclusive entrepreneurial ecosystems. And a little bit of my background is I come from the industry side. So I'm a serial entrepreneur and I grew up in high-tech startups. So I have a double undergrad degree, went back and got my MBA and graduated with my MBA in 1998 and started to go to work for high-tech startups right at the dot-com boom. And it was an exciting time to be a part of startups. And we've seen a lot of ups and downs over the years. One of the things that has been consistent is that diversity in entrepreneurship is not very good. And there are a lot of disparities. And for those of you who were in the earlier session, you saw the panelists and the experts there talk a lot about how there are disparities with regard to capital formation. Well, when you think about what it takes for an entrepreneur to be successful, it's more than just capital formation. There are many things that an entrepreneur needs to connect with in order to drive success for their business and personally. And so we're going to address some of those things today related to the ecosystem. Now, the other thing that's going to be a little different about our session today is that we're not going to go really deep into the facts as to that there are disparities. Ashley, in a couple minutes, she is going to set up some of those facts and set the frame for the discussion, but she's also going to touch on some of the solutions. So this session is going to be more solution focused. And part of the reason is because now that a lot of these disparities are very clear because of some of the research that's been done, we are seeing massive experimentation with people really trying to address some of these systemic issues. Now, the other piece of that is that you have a lot of people who are doing these experiments. And what we really need is to share in those learnings and learn from each other. So we've brought together some wonderful panelists who you'll hear from in a bit. And they're going to talk to you about gaps. They're going to talk to you about policies. They're going to talk to you about models and solutions. And our hope is that you leave here inspired and with knowledge, so that you can go back to your own sphere of influence and be prepared to take action. So I really encourage you during the session, lean in, ask questions. We're going to have the Q&A panel open and really look forward to the discussion. So my co-host for this afternoon, Ashley Brown, I'm going to turn it over to her. She is the Director of Research Services for the Kenan Institute, and she and her team have really done the heavy lifting with regard to the Trends Report. So really excited to have Ashley kick off our session today. Take it away, Ashley.
Hello, everyone. I'm really excited to be here. And just want to make sure, can you see my slides? All right, I'm going to take that as a yes. I really enjoyed the last panel discussion touching on disparities in capital formation. I think we're going to build on some of the threads of that conversation here in the Creating Inclusive Entrepreneurial Ecosystem session today. We have a wonderful group of panelists to talk on this subject as well. So as many of you, if not all of you, are here at this conference because you recognize that entrepreneurship is vital to economic growth, and it leads to job growth, more innovation, and a myriad of other societal benefits. And so if we quickly recap and go back to the previous session, we also know that historically, the pathway to entrepreneurship has been more challenging for some due to longstanding and systemic issues. And so Olaf shared a couple of these slides in the previous session, but I'm just going to touch on it really quickly. And so a lot of those challenges were exacerbated by COVID-19. In particular, we saw already under-resourced small business owners, namely minority and women business owners, had to shut their doors at higher rates during the pandemic. And then when you turn an eye towards venture capital and high growth startups, where VC funding had a decent 2020, we did see that women-owned companies were adversely impacted during the pandemic when it came to fundraising. And then similarly, people of color, and particularly Black founders, are still deeply underrepresented in the VC space, both as founders and investors, even as many VC firms have recognized a problem with underrepresentation and under-resourcing Black founders. So with all of that in mind, when we think about trends, we also know that there are trend lines we want to impact and create more growth opportunities that lead to greater access to jobs and wealth for everyone in these ecosystems, whether they're founders, investors, startup talent, and so on. And so the intent of this session and the accompanying trends report, which I highly recommend you go to frontiers.unc.edu, download the report. You can pick out certain sections or download the whole report. But the accompanying session that goes with this presentation really highlights the ecosystem builders who are infusing diversity and inclusion into entrepreneurial ecosystems and providing greater access into the economic engine that is entrepreneurship. And so today we have 4 panelists who are trying to affect change on these trend lines. I'll highlight their initiatives. I'm only going to briefly touch on each one, and then they can speak kind of deeper on each of the initiatives. But each person on this panel is working to build a robust and inclusive ecosystem through various mechanisms, many which lead to models and methods and ideas that can be instituted by other ecosystem builders, many who are on this call. And so these mechanisms include through policy making, through community development, by resource building through investors and corporations, and then also through educational systems. So first I want to start off with some shared definitions. To borrow from the Kauffman Foundation, an entrepreneurial ecosystem is a network of people supporting entrepreneurs and the culture of trust and collaboration that allows them to interact successfully. The speed at which talent, information, and resources move through the ecosystem can affect entrepreneurs at each stage in their life cycle. And so I imagine many people watching this presentation, see themselves as part of an entrepreneurial ecosystem. As for the word inclusive, we really speak to a broad set of attributes of those in the ecosystem, whether inclusion is based on race, gender, ethnicity, veteran status, rural, urban, LGBTQ, and so on. However, when I talk about specific research or initiatives, if it's specific to any group of founders or ecosystem partners, I'll be sure to specify that. And so quickly, I just want to go over 2 short slides, and there are many more in the report, on why inclusion and diversity matter for firms. Beyond the obvious, research indicates that more diverse teams and leadership can lead to better firm performance, and it can also spur more innovation. So obviously, these are 2 good things we're all aiming for. And so now I will turn our attention to talking about some of these initiatives and giving you kind of a high-level overview of some of the projects that our panelists are working on. And so the first one is related to policymaking. We'll start with the impacts. Through policymaking, we highlight several examples in the report, especially in the wake of COVID-19. But today we have Martha Legg-Miller with us, the director of the SEC's Office of the Advocate for Small Business Capital Formation. This is an independent office that was established in 2019 based on the bipartisan SEC Small Business Advocate Act of 2016. This office seeks to identify and address the unique challenges faced by small businesses and their investors, in particularly minority-owned and women-owned, rural, and natural disaster area small businesses. So a couple of ways they do this is through analyzing the impact of SEC rules and regulations on small business, and then also making policy recommendations to Congress and the SEC in support of small businesses and their investors. I also want to give a shout out. They have an excellent annual report with lots of really great data and information. We've pulled in some of that data into this report, so I highly recommend you check it out. So in their short time, they've started to make an impact on opening up opportunities for smaller companies to raise more capital through private capital markets. They've made several changes this last year, or advocated for several changes this past year. And so I recommend checking out the report to read over those. One I'm highlight here is, for instance, they recently successfully advocated for an increase in the amount of equity crowdfunding that a company could raise, from about 1 million up to 5 million. And this is important, especially when you see this trend line of growth in crowdfunding in the past year. And so now with that, I want to turn our attention to creating inclusive entrepreneurial ecosystems through community development. This is where we highlight the work of Rodney Sampson, the CEO of Opportunity Hub, general partner at 100 Black Angels and Allies Fund, and senior fellow at Brookings Institute. So in particular, we're highlighting Rodney's creation and implementation of equity districts. Designed in partnership with Dr. Del Gaines of the Kansas City Fed, Rodney and Dr. Gaines saw an opportunity to help solve the country's racial wealth equity gap by developing inclusive local tech ecosystems with a focus to promote Black tech entrepreneurship and increase Black tech employment. The goal is to turn around the statistics you see on the screen. And their approach is holistic, right? They developed an economic development pyramid, which is then realized through these equity districts. So I highly recommend checking out the video we provide on this screen. It's also in the report that you can go view. They also have a paper titled Building Entrepreneurial Ecosystems in Communities of Color. And so what I want to highlight in this pyramid in particular is how foundational earlier exposure, socialization, and skill development are in building inclusive tech ecosystems. This requires more partnerships, but it also allows for people to benefit at all levels. And so it's a great model that Rodney has started in 3 locations to date. And I'm sure he'll discuss this more in our panel discussion. So near the top of the pyramid is market and capital access. And so I want to quickly highlight the venture capital firms, including Rodney's 100 Black Angels and Allies, accelerators, incubators, and other organizations that are connecting Black and Brown founders to funding resources. Again, more details on this in the report. However, and also this is not an exhaustive list. And so finally, I want to discuss resource building through corporations. So amid the Black Lives Matter movement, particularly in the wake of George Floyd's murder and the pandemic fallout, we saw a fair amount of companies come out in support of Black communities and Black business. And so I actually have 2 colleagues at Keenan Flagler, Dr. Olga Hahn and Dr. Stephanie Mann, who are tracking corporate responses and pledges in the wake of the Black Lives Matter protests last spring. And I think one of the eventual goals of the research is to see, if companies act upon their words and their pledges. However, we do already know of models of corporations successfully moving from performative statements to develop more meaningful initiatives. And so one such model is the venture studio model. A venture studio serves almost like an incubator, but is infused with capital, consulting services, and access to other resources by corporations to startups. And it really helps supercharge a startup's ability to be successful. And so this model has been growing in popularity in recent years. I borrowed this slide from one of our senior editors, Sekou. So thank you, Sekou, for the slide. But today we have Davian Ross with us, who's a successful entrepreneur who was brought in to run marketing firm RGA's venture studio focused on Black founders called Coalition Venture Studios. And in this model, Black founders can leverage the expertise, networks, and resources of RGA. In turn, RGA has access to talented innovators, entrepreneurs that they can collaborate with and pull into various aspects of their business, including supply chain or product development. So that's where you see these positive, mutually beneficial network effects. And through these intentional and impactful relationships, companies can really move from performative statements to something more meaningful. And so before I end, I also want to quickly mention the UNC Entrepreneurship Center's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Solutions Certificate Program. This is being developed in partnership with Rodney and OHUB, and it's also has partners with Duke and Stanford. So this program helps company leaders at all levels think about how to integrate and operationalize DEI solutions across their business units and functions. And so again, it's about helping companies move, and drive equity-based impact for employees, for suppliers, for customers and investors, and really put their words into action. And so with that, I would say, please go to the website, frontiers.unc.edu. There's a lot more information in the trends report, highlighting all of these different groups who are doing some excellent work. And with that, I will give it back to Vicki.
Great. Thanks so much, Ashley. That was a wonderful intro and setup for our panelists here today. So I see them coming online and getting video ready and all that kind of stuff. So that's super exciting. Yay, and Davion made it. Davion just came from a board meeting, so I know that he was running late, but awesome. We've got him here now too. So we've got 4 amazing panelists here that I think are going to give us a very broad perspective on what Ashley just set up. So we've got Chuck Easley from Stanford Technology Venture Program, so representing academia. We have Martha Legg-Miller from the Office of the SEC Small Capital Formation for the Government and Policy. We have Rodney Sampson, so who's lived the life as a tech investor and now is working on equity districts and a fund. And Davion Ross also lived the life as a technology investor and now is running our Coalition Venture Studio. So instead of me trying to give you all of the details behind it, what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring them up onto the virtual stage now, and I'm going to let each of them introduce themselves. So this is kind of how we're going to run the session. They're going to go through brief introductions of themselves. I'm going to ask them each an individual question and then some general questions. And I would say I was super excited to see that we already have a question in the Q&A, but this is, an exciting interactive topic. So please put your questions in there and I will pull them into the conversation as we go along. So I'm going to start off, we're going to actually do those intros in a reverse alphabetical order by your first name. So Rodney, you are first up.
Oh, wow. Thank you, Vicki. It's excited to be a part of this conversation and to see co-conspirators in this work as a part of this session. I'll be brief. I've been in the technology ecosystem for over 20 years, first as a startup founder myself. One of the first Black founders to raise millions of venture capital in the country. And as I guess history and the articles that were written might record, the first in the South. And that company was acquired in 2010 for 8 figures. And, seeing the outlier effect of folks like myself and Davion and Arlen Hamilton and just different, entrepreneurs that were building high growth companies, you literally could put us all on a jumbo jet and we fit. To date, there have only been about 300, a little over 300 Black and brown tech founders that have raised over $1 million in venture capital, and that's in the last 21 years. So that's the only data point I'm going to give you today. So to do something about that, my wife and I started Opportunity Hub in 2013. We've been in existence for 8 years. Opportunity Hub exists as a social enterprise. There's a foundation, and then there's the venture fund, 100 Black Angels and Allies as well. I also spend some of my time at the Brookings Institution as a non-resident senior fellow, and excited to be a part of the faculty at UNC, Chapel Hill, and Duke as well. Thank you for having me today.
Thank you, Rodney. And I'm going to turn it over next to Martha for your intro.
Thank you very much. And I appreciate Ashley's wonderful introduction. She told everybody a little bit about our team. I come from the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, and I get to wake up every day and work with a talented team of people who are focused on how we can make sure that access to capital works well for entrepreneurs and their investors, no matter where they're located, what they look like, or what their personal background. And I get to give a lovely governmenty disclaimer that when I talk, I'm speaking with my own perspectives, which should come as no surprise for you, not necessarily on behalf of the entire federal government or agency. But I'm really excited about this conversation today and to be here sharing the stage at the virtual Keenan event. So thank you.
Thank you, Martha. And Davion, if you could do your intro next.
It is a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Vicki. You guys know that I'm coming hot off a board meeting, which ran an hour and a half late. So I appreciate Vicki's flexibility. My name is Davion Ross. I'm one of the founders of Shot Tracker. As Rodney mentioned, we have been very fortunate to raise capital. We just announced a round with investments from Hearst Ventures, who is one of the owners of ESPN, Verizon and Evertz. So we've been able to raise approximately 40 million and have been really fortunate. One of my investors was RGA Ventures, and I've had a long-standing relationship with them, being part of the Dodgers Accelerator. And over the last 12 months, we were talking about, hey, what can be done, and how can we make an impact? And I'm very fortunate that RG approached me about partnering with them to do Coalition Venture Studios, based on the premise that minorities and Blacks, to be more specifically, got 1% of the capital in 2019, and the last numbers I saw was approximately, I think, 0.67% for 2020. And how can we make a difference? And so I feel very excited and fortunate to be part of, an EIR working with, RGA, in addition to, helping to run and take Shot Tracker, which to the next level. But today we'll focus on the Coalition Venture Studios, and our ultimate goal is to be able to provide relationship capital. You guys may or may not know RGA, but they're a 2,000 person, 20 office, large company that is really an innovation company. They've brought some of our, if you're a sneakerhead like me, you're very familiar with the sneakers app from Nike. They brought that to market. They worked on Beats. There's a whole slew of products where they've really been on the cutting edge, and they have relationships with most of the Fortune 1000. So what we're trying to do with Coalition Ventures is to be able to democratize that access for underrepresented founders. Also looking at providing creative capital to underrepresented founders. Creative capital is the same person that's working on the Google project via RGA, help you with your work, and then also financial capital from an investment perspective. So I'm very excited about what Vicki and her team is doing, and I feel very fortunate and privileged to be here. So thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, Davion. And rounding us out is Chuck Easley from STVP. So if you could introduce yourself, that'd be awesome.
Hey, thanks, Vicki. Really excited to be here with everyone. I'm Chuck Easley. I'm a faculty member here at Stanford in the School of Engineering and part of our Entrepreneurship Center, the Stanford Technology Ventures Program. I'm also chair of our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee for the department, and look forward to talking more about the role of higher education in creating more inclusive ecosystems.
Great, thanks, Chuck. So as y'all can see, amazing panelists, so we'll dive right in. So I'm gonna direct, again, a question to each of our panelists as we get going. So Martha, my first question is gonna come to you. And it's really around, what is the role of government as it relates to, addressing some of these disparities? I know you and your organization have done a lot, but can you also just speak broadly to the role government can play, and also what type of, long-term versus short-term effects y'all are really going for?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's a hard one to answer because government, it depends on if you're looking at local, if you're looking at state or federal. And I think each layer has a role to play. From my lens at the Securities and Exchange Commission, most people associate us as the regulators of Wall Street, and they think of us when they think about public companies and they think about investment professionals, but they don't think about the SEC when they're thinking about access to earlier stage capital and entrepreneurs. But facilitating capital formation is one of the three key pieces of our agency's mission. And so it's critically important that we have tools and solutions that work for everybody to bring their ideas to market. One of the challenges that is, as we were prepping for this event and talking as a group, is that there's nothing in our securities law that mentions race, doesn't mention ethnicity, it doesn't mention gender, sexuality, or any other personal status marker. It's seemingly blind as to who you are. But one of the things that we know, if you look at the trends report, and Ashley mentioned that we put out a report to Congress each year. If you look at the report we sent in, and I think everybody who's listening to this today is tuned in because you're interested in the data on what's happening with capital raising. And you know that capital access bears out very differently depending on who you are, where you're from, what you look like, what your network is like. And so we have a question that needs to be asked of why is that? And is there something about the system that needs to be addressed from the policy side as well as from the market side to make sure that there is not some sort of a legal impediment or barrier that exists that is making it harder to bring ideas to market? So that's the genesis of our team in a nutshell. Our team was created by Congress. It came out almost unanimously out of committee. And I think everybody knows Congress at this point, when they agree unanimously on something, you know it's pretty important. It's also a rare beacon. And so we were created to really ask, why is capital access challenging in some areas? What needs to be fixed and how should we do it? And there was unanimous agreement that someone needed to focus on that. So that's where our office came from. And, you know, to be clear, the rules that we have on our capital markets, they were created with great intentions around investor protection and making sure that there are the right disclosures for investors and companies, and that we have a well-functioning market. But I think it's incumbent on us to ask about potential unintended consequences in ways that the market is not serving everyone. I think that Yael highlighted that earlier when she was saying you can look at it from the top, but we also have to look at from the bottom and see who's left out of those macro statistics. So happy to have further conversations as we delve into it. I know that the other co-panelists have lots of thoughts about ideas and ways that the government should play a role. So it is incumbent on me to listen rather than just talking about what those solutions can look like.
Thanks, Martha. That was very, very interesting. Excited to dig in later with this. My next question I'm going to direct to Chuck. So sort of thinking on the zoom out is, you know, what is the role that higher ed plays and education plays? And I think there's two sides to that. There's educating the next generation of entrepreneurs, but then there's also the role of research. And, you know, Martha was talking about research and sort of looking at the intention of a policy, but then looking at the real data. So Chuck, can you speak to the role that, you know, higher ed can play in helping to create more inclusive ecosystems?
Certainly. You know, that's a good way to divide up the various roles, because I think there's a lot of different ways that higher ed needs to be involved and has to change, because the future is diverse, and we all know that, you know, diversity is critical for our education and research missions. So the way that we've been thinking about dividing it up is, you know, increases in representation are absolutely critical. And so recruiting, diversifying the faculty, the staff, diversifying the student body, so that those future scholars are there to be the role models for the students, and also to be looking into research and increasing our body of academic knowledge about the role that diversity and race and gender play in entrepreneurship. And, you know, a lot of folks have been doing good work in these areas, but there's still a lot that we don't know about what the effective interventions are. And so that's the first thing that we've been really focused on is diversifying our faculty, diversifying the student body at all levels. And then the second thing that we've been working on is the climate and sense of belonging. And so we've been doing that through having conversations with faculty across the department about diversifying syllabi. If you take a look at the guest speakers that come into the classroom, that come into seminars, the role models that are up there in front of the classroom, the mentors that work with students, and actually gather the data over the past, say, 3 to 5 years is what we did in our department. We were shocked at the results of the cumulative. I think we had 35 out of maybe 500 guest speakers in our department over the past 5 years that were historically underrepresented in STEM fields. So the climate, the sense of belonging, the environment, the representation, and then working on more research in these areas about effective interventions. I think those are some of the really critical areas that we've been prioritizing.
Great, thanks for that, Chuck. Next, I'm going to turn my question to Rodney. So Rodney, you've played a lot of different roles. You've been a founder. You've also with OHUB, y'all are doing things around talent acquisition. You're a funder through 100 Black Angels and Allies, and as an ecosystem builder through your equity district. So the partnership model and all of these entities working together is really something that has been central to your work. What do you think is the role of government, of partners, of education in creating all of the, I guess, details or all of the pieces that you need to create inclusive ecosystems?
Excellent question. It probably took a decade or so, particularly being a founder where you really, you think you can just, build something on a laptop, push it out and change the world and not really need to think about what's happening in government. There are different, philosophical approaches to, kind of the spectrum of capitalism that exists, that a lot of times entrepreneurs and investors who've been able to create sort of this bubble of opportunity and wealth for themselves may not want to participate. And then it just became such a stark reality, particularly when I was working on Kingonomics, 12 innovative currencies for transforming your business and life. And I really double clicked on how Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movement were literally creating an ecosystem around, national civil liberties and human dignity, and that policy was precedent. And when I started looking at how policy literally had been used to disenfranchise a certain class of Americans or group of Americans, policy was legal, chattel slavery was legalized poverty. Jim Crow was legalized, states' rights. And then it took policy to change that, right? And then I started to double click on the policies, even, looking at the Nixon era and looking at what Donald Rumsfeld did in terms of creating the economic opportunities around Black economic empowerment, which was a part of their policy. And so if you look at even historically what Republicans have done and what Democrats have done, there have been different policies. The creation of the Minority Business Development Agency, through executive order. So policy is just precedent in everything. And so just, in my 2+ decades of hindsight, I've come to realize that we've got to have government at the table around policy formation, putting forth these ideas, understanding how systems work, how agencies work. Everyone wants to kind of bang on the doors of the agencies and say the SEC needs to do this and Commerce needs to do that. And if you don't understand how to navigate and how the systems work, you'll just be like a tinkling sound. And so understanding how policy formation works is incredibly important. And then you got to loop in higher ed, the research, the government contracts, the industry contracts, where we are impressing upon undergraduates and graduate students to look at entrepreneurialism and how it is a, part of the American construct. So all of those things are important, even before you get to like the industry where the founders are actually being accelerated. And as a founder, to understand how you building a business in America requires the involvement of government, requires the participation of higher ed, the participation of other stakeholders and associations. You'll be a better founder for it, and you'll be a better investor for it, and you'll be a better ecosystem developer for it.
Thanks, Rodney. Great thoughts. Next question, I'm heading over to Davion. So Davion, you too have held a number of different roles, right? Startup founder, now you're heading up this venture studios, the EIR. Looking sort of back on your path as a founder and someone who's running a, large business right now that has attracted a lot of investment, how do things look the same or different from when you started your journey to now and the startups that are coming through your coalition studio?
Yeah, it's a fair question, and to be honest with you, my experience was somewhat the inspiration for where we wanted to go, because I felt like it was important to, I got tired, as Rodney said, we were the exceptions versus the rule in so many situations when it comes to capital raising, right? And if we're trying to make change as a society, we got to have less of it being the exception and more of it being a rule, so that we can actually democratize access. So, when I took a look at, internally what I was going through, we are where we are today because of the village. It takes a village. It's RGA Ventures making that first introduction to Fox and Intel for us to do a pilot, so that we can get a referenceable client and show people that this technology actually works. It's RGA facilitating an introduction to Nike to have sensors put in their basketball, because Nike has 70% of the Division I market for shot tracker. It's RGA facilitating an introduction to Verizon that led to a $2 million investment and them now pushing our technology. So when I looked at my path and I looked at the inspiration, all the things that I was fortunate, it wasn't just me, right? It took the entire village to make it happen. So that sparked the thought process on, okay, how do we make this available and democratize this access? Not because they're invested in me, but how do we democratize this access so that we can have more success based on companies like RGA breaking down these barriers to help founders of color? So when I think about it, I think about that experience. And the ultimate goal is to democratize that and make that available to so many different, founders. So what we've been doing is actually building this Rolodex of founders of color. And the beautiful thing about it is that, I'm working with an organization that has decided that this is important. Because to Rodney's point, if the organization at the top levels don't decide that this is important, then we're not going to have the success. So I'm working with an organization that says, hey, this is important, and we're going to commit to this. We're going to commit to every pilot, every project. Let's look to startups to bring them into the fold. The thing about it is that people have been doing this before, but underrepresented founders haven't had a seat at the table to be able to be part of it. I mean, RGA has done this before. I mean, they just did a big project in LA with Shopify, Snap, Jordan Brand, and some company by the name of Dark Store that nobody had heard about before it. But it was a huge success, which put Dark Store on the map. Now, what we're actually seeing in the society is that a lot of people are actually investing. So there's a lot of financial dollars being put. I mean, the last 30 to 45 days, we've seen two black-led VCs raise, over $240 million. That's amazing. But I also don't want us to minimize the power of a referenceable client and non-diluted capital in a project that then you can leverage to raise more capital and then to show other people that you have your technology in place. So, I mean, as I said before, there's three factors: the relationship, the creative, and the financial being the smallest one, because RGA is not a big investor, but where they can really help is having access to that slew of blue chip clients and making that access available to founders and underrepresented founders who traditionally wouldn't have access, which is able to move that needle. And as I said before, that was inspired by the experiences that I had.
That's great. That was really good insights already. All right. Thank y'all for those answering those questions and kind of helping to set the stage for all the different elements that are going on here. So again, for the audience, drop your questions in the Q&A and we will get to those questions. The first question that I want to kind of launch into, y'all, is all of y'all are working on different initiatives. And there's always the question of, well, how do you measure success? You know, how do you know at the end of the day, did it achieve what you wanted to achieve? And for all of the people sitting in the audience, as they're implementing things, they're probably struggling with that same thing. So I was wondering if y'all could give some insights with how you think about measuring success. Is there a way to sort of go about this that is the right way versus the wrong way, that can help inform our audience as they do some of this work?
I'll chime in. You know, that's an excellent question because there's in the conversations around you know, racial equity in tech ecosystems as a way to actually close the racial wealth gap. It started to become a little bit, you know, kind of performative and cliches. I mean, like if a founder is pitching me, they're like, you know, I want to raise capital, I want to execute because I want to close the racial wealth gap. You know, we're committing, you know, $1 million over 10 years, you know, that's $100K a year. And we want to close the racial wealth gap. And I think that as a community, if we don't actually understand the numbers related to actually closing that racial wealth gap, we'll just have great sounding press releases and data points of people saying we want to close the racial wealth gap. And so I think that, you know, from our perspective at OHUB, even inside of, you know, our various programs or our equity district model, and we outline this and codify some of these metrics in the guide we did with the Federal Reserve Bank with Dr. Dale Gines. It's demonstrating at each level of the ecosystem the different metrics. So at the early exposure level, of course, that's the easiest to socialize and accomplish, because when you're exposing people to the ecosystem, I'm just going to wrap everything in the ecosystem. I won't, you know, go too deep or bifurcate it or triage it out, but it's like raising your hand and say, okay, I'm interested. You know, I've been exposed. Oh, this is interesting. The next level, when you talk about, you know, upskilling and training, well, the metrics are, you know, how many people began the program, how many finished, and how many got placed. And then what did they make in those jobs? And then what's their trajectory for job creation? I mean, for income, let's say for the next 3, 5, 10 years. So that's another metric. You know, at the entrepreneurship levels, how many new ventures were created, but we know business formation by itself does not guarantee successful business. You know, we have to track capital raised, revenue generated, and not just gross revenue, but long-term, we want to track like EBITDA, like what's the net revenue, because that's where the wealth is created when you return that capital to your investors. So when we get at that granular level, you have to have the base unit economics of ecosystem building, and then you have to apply that to your geographical region. So for instance, if you're building an inclusive ecosystem, you want to know in X geography, you know, X% of the population is in this economic income bracket. And then how do we change that? Or this is what the racial wealth gap, this is what the wealth gap in that region. And most of that data is readily accessible in public. And then you start to just chop away at that, you know, kind of like one job created at a time, one company created at a time. And so that's sort of like on the ecosystem side. And then to measure DAIS, you know, that's a whole other conference. You know, you'll get that in the certificate, but there are metrics in terms of how to operationalize DAIS inside of an organization so that it's not just, you know, kind of logos in an annual report, but you can really report out, you know, how many women did you add to your board? How many Black women did you add, or Black people did you add to your board? You know, what's your head count, right? What's your procurement look like? You know, are your products fair and ethical? You know, what's your budget for marketing to Black and brown communities? So all of these different things you can track. And then I think if we lay those out, people will know. So.
Yeah, so that, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I don't know. I was just going to piggyback on what Rodney was saying, that I think he's bringing up some really good points on kind of the importance of measuring things if we want to see change and document change. One of the things that I think is really challenging on the policy front is we all want data before we take action. And we want to know that we are taking action and we're moving in the right direction based on some sort of information that shows causality. But the really hard piece about the area that we're discussing right now is it's really hard to claim a causal impact with any one specific change or tweak to the system. And that makes it, I think, really difficult. So to me, it comes back to really measuring what matters and figuring out what are our KPIs, what are we actually trying to solve for, and then going from there into the numbers. But that also brings up, I think, a good point that is fleshed out a little bit in the trends report, which is that if we just look at aggregate level information, it's going to completely skew the picture. If you look at aggregate level information about capital raising in 2020, it's going to completely skew the picture. And the reason why is we saw a significant preponderance of deal flow doubling down on existing portfolio companies and not going into new companies. We saw that, yes, venture funds had a banner year and raised a ton of money because people were looking, as Steve Kaplan highlighted earlier, they were looking for those outside returns. What we also saw is one of the largest dips in small and first-time funds, which is Yael. I mean, I'm bringing it all full circle. As Yael was highlighting this earlier this morning, those are the investors that are backing our minority founders, our women founders, our founders that are in non-coastal entrepreneurial ecosystems. And so I think that as we look at the measurements, we have got to get past the headline number that is an aggregate stat, and we have to look at an individual level and figure out what that impact looks like for ordinary people that are building companies all across the country, not just for the spotlight grabbing stat where we have an outlier that throws off the entire data set and really doesn't tell the whole story. You know, if we just look at Davion's story and we hear that he raised, $40 million, we think, wow, that is an incredible example of success. Davion's in a small circle of really successful founders of color, and that shouldn't be the case. But if we just look at the wrong data point, it's going to throw the entire thing off. We have to look at him in context and figure out how we can make that something that's replicable and scalable, and where he's not sitting as an outlier for national trends and stats. So that's where, when I look at the data, I want to know not just what the aggregate level information is saying, but let's peel back the onion a little bit and figure out what questions we're not asking about the information and what we're measuring, and start to measure other really critical elements that are true performance indicators for where we're trying to go. So that's how I think about the data. Would love to get thoughts from the others on the panel on how they look at it as well. And Chuck, I cut you off right as you were about to jump in, and you might have been saying the same thing. So I'll let you dive in next.
That's all right, Martha. I was just going to chime in with a few anecdotes about, obviously from an academic research standpoint, data is really critical. But even just in terms of like practically doing the work to create change, having access, it's interesting how difficult sometimes it is in academic institutions just to get basic data points about, what's the percentage of historically underrepresented applicants that we have, and how has that changed over time? What's the percentage of diverse staff members, adjuncts, lecturers? All of this is really, really helpful when you're trying to make decisions about what policies within the department or within the university need to change, and the ability to break down, is the problem with our admit rate, or is it actually with the yield rate of getting folks to come once they've been admitted? In our case, the biggest problem has actually been in the number of applicants. And so then that tells us something about where we need to focus our efforts in targeted recruiting. And then the ability to compare across departments. How is our department doing relative to mechanical engineering, relative to computer science? Why are there differences there? What are they doing that we're not doing? All of this data is really practical, actually, in terms of making productive changes and using our limited resources in the most effective ways to diversify the future STEM workforce in our case. So it's absolutely critical that we have some sharing and also that we have some data on where resources are going. So one of the first topics I got interested in was the role of the endowment, at least in Stanford's case, in investing in more diverse VCs and putting some attention on, what percentage of the endowment is actually going to support diverse venture capital funds and private equity funds. What percentage of the people making those decisions come from historically underrepresented groups? I think the question on data is obviously going to get the attention of academics for research, but it's really practical just in terms of these resource allocation decisions as well.
Cool. Davion, did you have any comments, or do you want me to jump in with another question?
Jump in with another question. These guys knocked it out of the park. I don't want to go after those three. Not on this question. They crushed it. I mean, look, I echo their sentiments. So, we could move on. I don't have anything additional to add.
Cool. Well, the next one, I think I want to look at, it actually combines some of the stuff you said, Davion, and how RGA has been really instrumental in in the success of your company. And also a question that Mike Nerona had asked in the Q&A, which was the role that investors can actually play in organizations, pushing them to be more diverse or making their own investment decisions around sort of diversity requirements, right? Sort of looking at what they're requiring. Do you think these like policies and ways of operating, do you think they're good? Are they bad? Are they somewhere in between? Because I think a lot of times it's the way that they're implemented. And so I think there's some nuances there that may require some discussion. So I wanted to just throw that out as far as, the role that investors play was sort of either helping or also encouraging very directly companies that they've invested in to diversify and go along the DEIA strategy or diversity, equity, inclusion solutions and really sort of embed this into their organization. So I'll throw that out there.
Yeah, no, I think it's significant the role that investors play in I mean, we all know that organizations take the DNA or the culture coming from either the founder or the board or potentially investors sometime. And I think investors play a significant role. I think that, when you have investors who are trying to bridge this wealth gap and seeing the impact, I think they have to make the first start by looking to really manage their bias. And, the fact of the matter, right? A lot of people have bias and they don't necessarily know it's bias as part of it, just in their decision making, because it's what they've always done. And, I think investors play a really critical role in that, investing in more diverse founders. And I think in situations where they don't invest in a diverse founder, I think it's important for them to be asking the questions. And I've heard some investors talk about this, like, hey, who's on your board? What does your board dynamic look like? What does your team look like? And I think they have power, right? Because the power is where the money is. And if they're investing in that company, there are stipulations and things that they can put in place to help really drive it. I think a lot of times, if you just allow people just ask these, soft questions, but don't put metrics on people or, like we're talking about, or don't put demands on people to force them to make the change, people are going to go back into their, everyday, organic, natural inclinations. So I do think that investors play a part in not only who they give the capital to, but making sure that they push on their portfolio companies to ask the question of making sure that they have diversity in the organization. And if people, look, if we look at the stats, right, it's evident, right? Diverse teams perform 30% better. Like, as an investor, you should want this. You should want diversity in your organization because there's a higher probability of success. And you should be pushing that down. And my hope is that it keeps trickling down and we see that, that access to capital being delivered to underrepresented founders. And look, the time is now, right? This is probably, if I look at the history of, I'm from Trinidad and Tobago, so I've been in the US since 1996 when I came out here on my basketball scholarship. And if I look back in the time period, that I have been in the US, I have never seen the US in a place where people are actually admitting and looking at diversity and trying to empower and trying to make the right decisions. So the time is now. If you're a portfolio company and your investors aren't doing it, we should be asking them about it, and we should all be holding each other accountable so that we could drive this change. Because as I said before, it's going to take a village, and investors play a very significant role. They aren't the silver bullet. Excuse me, they're by no means the silver bullet, but they do play a significant role because money talks, that they have the capital to deploy.
Fabian, I think that's spot on. And what you're talking about with having investors who understand the market that they're addressing and that understand the population that needs the product that an entrepreneur is pitching is absolutely critical. Bringing in bias, I think that the topic of discussion that always comes in with bias in the investing space is pattern matching. I mean, we know that you are 21% more likely as an entrepreneur to raise money from someone who looks like you than from someone that doesn't. And that's an important thing for us to keep in mind, because it means that that investor understands the value proposition differently of what someone who looks like them is doing. And so breaking some of the trends that we see where we have founders who, as Arlen Hamilton says, go underestimated, their product is truly underestimated because the investor doesn't understand the customer need that they're serving. That requires us to have investors on the other side of the table who have an understanding of the person they're sitting across from. Because all of this, as much as we break it down into bar graphs and line graphs and trends and data, it comes down to people and how people make decisions. And we have to empower people to make good decisions and to be sophisticated, savvy investors that are at the table, because that is really how we're going to see change, I think. I know that's an area that Rodney's been working on. I feel like I'm teeing it up, Rodney. This is the moment where you should just take it away and run with, okay, I've got the ideas. I've been working with it because I know I've heard about your ideas. So come on, tell us.
Thank you. I mean, that was a layup. I mean,
I'm going to use all the basketball analogies today with Davion.
Absolutely. So, yeah, I mean, one of the things that we're excited about in our collaboration with Vicki and her team is this Black Technology Ecosystem Investment Certificate we've created and will be taught during the fall. And we're also excited about the faculty collaboration from Stanford, Chuck and his team, and Duke as well. The numbers might be a little outdated, but in 2016, Pew data and US Census data suggested that 1% to 2% of Black Americans were accredited per SEC standards. So if there are 44 million Black Americans, 1% is 440,000. And then, 2%, you do the math. Now, of course, the data did reveal that was predominantly in personal residences for those who were accredited. We know Dodd-Frank doesn't allow, that was one of the major issues I had with the Dodd-Frank legislation, is when it required your personal property to be included, not to be included as a part of your net worth that qualifies you for these type of investments. But I mean, even if there were 10,000, even if there were 1,000, I'm kind of like, Lot talking to God on his way to Nineveh. Is there one? I'll save it for 3. I'll save it for 10. I'll save the city. And so we believe that we can unlock this class of Black angels and LPs and also limited partners that will be allies in this work as well. And so through education, through exposure, and through giving them access to an asset class through a vehicle where they may not be able to afford to invest in the large venture funds, but they can invest in smaller funds, which will then go invest in those funds. And so I think there's, we talk a lot about racial equity and unlocking the capital that mostly non-Black people control, but we also have to talk about the capital that Black people do control, and how do we leverage that capital to get them into the ecosystem through these type of syndicates or these venture funds. And the Jobs Act is a phenomenal platform, Reg CF and Reg A Plus, and it was exciting to see more companies use Reg CF and now Reg A Plus as a means to raising capital. I mean, we could do a whole nother summit just on that. So, you know.
On to what Rodney's sharing about that. And when he's talking about Reg CF and Reg A Plus, for those who are not steeped in regulatory citations, that's talking about crowdfunding where you raise equity capital over the internet. And then Reg A Plus is really what people often refer to as the mini IPO. But this past summer, we saw, and if you look at the statistics, they're in our annual report. I'll give a lovely plug for it. But we saw that in 2 months over the summer, there was more activity with more small businesses raising equity over the internet using crowdfunding than over the first couple of years of crowdfunding, because of the number of companies that saw this as a lifeline to stay alive and to bring their customer networks, their social networks on board as owners and as a part of the community that was going to keep those companies going. And that's, I think, that was a critical moment, I think, for me to see the power and impact of a relatively decentralized cap table where you have a lot of people who have an ownership stake in a company and want to see it be successful. And you really saw platforms and the companies that were building cap tables using crowdfunding really seeing more success than they had ever seen. So that was a big moment over the summer, and something that I think is a really telling jump in that trend line, which that jump in that trend line really comes down to people and to jobs and communities across the country.
Cool. Thanks. Go ahead, Chuck.
Yeah, I was just going to mention, you know, the crowdfunding developments are definitely encouraging and an interesting trend. Peter Youngkin at Oregon's got some interesting work that also, you know, shows that, you know, these issues of bias and discrimination show up in crowdfunding campaigns as well, unfortunately. So I think that's why, you know, it's really critical, as Rodney and Martha have been mentioning, that, you know, we need to think about not only educating the future entrepreneurs, but also doing education and training for the future investors, and diversifying that set of angels and VCs, and you know, getting communities who have typically been left out of the entrepreneurship ecosystem to you know, become angel investors. And, you know, we know from work by Deepak Hegde at NYU, and also David Shu and co-authors have shown that, you know, co-ethnic investment ties, entrepreneurs are much more likely to get investment from co-ethnic ties. And so I think, you know, rather than waiting for the venture capital community to become more diverse and hire more, getting more folks to transition to angel investment, and then from angel investment to potentially getting into VC, is a super promising area to be working on.
Thanks. Thank you. So I'm going to hit a question from the panel, from the Q&A, and then I'm going to do a lightning round, so just kind of give us a time check. But Sekou Burmese, who's a new professor that has just joined us at Keenan Flagler, he asked a question that speaks to some area of expertise, sports and entertainment, that I know Davion and also Rodney have experience with, but also looking at this wealth gap piece. So when you look at, you know, he speaks to the fact that sports and entertainment has produced more Black millionaires than any other industry. Well, when you look at generational wealth within Black communities, that's one of the challenges. And how do you get all of the investment capital that is in the hands of Black millionaires into these constructs? And I don't know any ideas for how to tie that, or how to educate, or how to unlock that capital and put it towards, you know, startups and founders and investments in these areas.
I mean, I can jump in here because, you know, I think this is a plug for some of the stuff that, you know, some of the stuff that Rodney's doing. I mean, I think that, you know, when I think about the scenario, I think about access. Historically, you know, Black folks haven't necessarily had access to the deals, and when we do get access to the deals, it's too late, right? It's when they go public or later stage, to the point where the value has already been created. and the folks that were in first has already got 100x, and then you're jumping in and you're getting just a small. So I mean, I think access is the solution, and I think that when I think about like 100 Black angels and allies, you know, the mere fact that, you know, that fund has now access to Mac Venture Capital, who just raised 110 and is an LP in that fund. So if you think about it, it's a matter of, you know, finding the places where we have access so that we can play in the game. There's a lot of, you know, Silicon Valley companies right now that has been built off of like the Black ecosystem, the Black culture, and minority cultures right now. And you know, we these cultures haven't been able to capitalize on the value that they created for someone else. So the only way to capitalize on that value is to be an owner. And so I think that that type of access is, I mean, I'm sure that there's many other ways, and hopefully what we're doing is this cycle, right, where we invest in, you know, Black founders that then can sell their company, that become Black investors, and they invest in more Black entrepreneurs, and then we have that cycle, and some of these people get access into the funds that are actually creating deals, and those people invest more. So hopefully there's a cycle that we're seeing coming, and I'm really bullish on it because I'm actually seeing it. Like I'm actually doing deals with, you know, as part of 100 Black Angels, and you know, being an LP there, and doing deals with other friends who historically they would never talk about investing. Everybody's like, oh man, I'm going to put my money in the stock market. So I think more education is important so people understand that this is an investment vehicle that's like a real investment vehicle. More access is important to get access to the deals early enough so you can get the substantial returns. I was talking to a friend of mine who he was telling me he was on the board of a high school in California, and one of the board members in high school was a venture capitalist, and he went to the high school and said, hey, put $15,000 in this investment. That $15,000 was in Snap, and then they go public and they get a check for $24 million. So that's what I'm saying. There has to be a certain level of education and access to the ecosystem and to the deals to really help move the needle. And we hope that founders who can invest have success, and they start investing, and we start building that cycle to really move the needle.
Davion is right. You know, when I think about hacking it, just in my experiences of, you know, working to get celebrities and athletes involved in the ecosystem, and you know, we've had some success, not as much as we wanted to, but now you start to see like some of the work of like Rashawn Williams. So every time a big tech company goes public, you know, everyone talks about Nas, right? But behind Nas, that was really actually making the investments and doing the work, was Rashawn Williams, you know? And so when you talk about, oh, Nas is gonna make, you know, a boatload of money out of Coinbase, and he was in WeWork, and he was in this company, and that was basically all Rashawn Williams. So, but it was developing that trust, right? And I think when I think about hacking it, you know, I see some problematic trends where I see a lot of professional athletes, I see a lot of celebrities, you know, when they basically partner up with managers that are not from their community, their capital does not reach the community. Like they're excited about going into like, you know, Silicon Valley funds. Like they do tours to Sand Hill Road, and it's like, you know, I see folks like Diddy jumping in Silicon Valley funds, and I'm like, Diddy, we need your capital in Atlanta. You know, we need it in Raleigh-Durham. We need it in Kansas City, and you know, other Black cities. And so, you know, I think about the leverage, you know, just with like the people on this panel. Like if we send a joint letter, you know, from RGA, from Stanford, from the SEC, from UNC, just to the NFL, to the NBA, you know, to the women's NBA, the Major League. But if we send a letter saying we'd like to have a conversation and just talk about the data and where the opportunities are, our collective influence could actually help to move the needle versus like, a Black VC or a Black founder who they may not know and have no context, and they're really, really guarded, right? You know, they've got the agent around them, and then the agent is bringing the financial manager to the table, and then you got mom and them and cousin and them. So by the time you have this entourage around them, it's not a lot of stuff that gets through, but they'll always listen to their league. And so we just have to think about how we hack it, because it's definitely a source of capital, could definitely be, you know, as they say, off the sideline and into the game.
Yeah, you know, for a lot of academics, looking at social networks has been, you know, a big subfield. And so, you know, in terms of network effects, there's not much that could do more for a startup than getting, you know, big celebrity endorsement on social media. So, you know, while we might have in popular culture a division here between Northern California and Southern California, in the startup ecosystem, there's a really tight link there. And, you know, it's particularly important for consumer internet and for retail. But there's an important bridge there that, you know, all the digital marketers and all the growth hackers know in consumer internet, how to get access to the, you know, big stars and down in LA. And, you know, it's interesting to hear Rodney talk about the, you know, folks investing Silicon Valley funds. Meanwhile, Ron Conway, one of the most famous angel investors here in Silicon Valley, is looking to invest in minority and Black funds. You know, I know he's an investor in Slauson and Company. You know, Austin Clements is down in LA and doing great work there with programs to run accelerators for early stage entrepreneurs. So I think there is an insight there about that potential linkage between the startup community and the celebrities, influencers, and so on, which are critical to getting attention and distribution.
Well, the other thing I may add is that, I mean, and that's why I think education is so important, right? Is because, like, people are starting to get excited of Silicon Valley, and Silicon Valley is almost, you know, changing, you know, they're already over the tipping point and heading on the other side. Like, people look to other areas. And I think that's what happened, right? People, you know, when you're not necessarily privy to what's going on, you get to the hot thing. Like, if you think about, you know, some of these companies, right, whether it's Clubhouse, whoever, right, there was a point in time where it was heated, and now everybody's getting access. So, and I think that's what happens in the capital markets, right? Now everybody's trying to get to Silicon Valley. Well, there are other things that are heating up. And that's why I say part of it is just a ton of education to help people understand we have to be thinking to get on the front end of the trend, and not necessarily when the trend has become, you know, the most popular thing. We got to get on the front end of it.
Martha, did you have a comment? You took yourself off of mute.
I did take myself off of mute because I was sitting there thinking about this from all of the academic folks that are listening and jotting down ideas for research. One of the things that's really hard, and Chuck was highlighting how the impact of social network theory. But one of the things that I think is really hard is measuring different networks and how far they take you as an entrepreneur, and what are the impediments for various different groups. And there is a need for better research about who is bridging the barriers between entrepreneurs, particularly entrepreneurs who don't already have the network to the investors. Who is bridging that network? How is it that the companies are finding success when they are able to go outside of their social network construct? Because that, I think, is critical. And if we're going to really see capital flowing and moving from, as Davion was mentioning, from your Silicon Valley, your hotbeds where there is a ton of capital concentrated, but it needs to start chasing the deals that are elsewhere in the country. What's the mechanism for connecting to those founders? In particular, what's the mechanism for connecting outside of those investors' own personal networks so that the funding actually really flows well? And that's an area, if you've got ideas on research for it, or you want to have further conversations, email me. I would love to have a conversation. That goes for anybody who is listening, because it's an area that we really need to start measuring and figuring out how capital is going to start flowing around the country better.
All right. So I would love to carry on this conversation for the rest of the afternoon, but Sydney, in organizing the conference, would really be angry with me. And she's done an amazing job organizing and getting this set. So I'm not going to do that. So I'm going to do a quick lightning round, and then I'm going to bring us to a close. So the lightning question is, in 20 years, what would the world look like? How would you be able to tell if we were successful in building inclusive ecosystems, if we were successful in working together on some of the things y'all have been bringing up, what would look different, and how would you know that we'd done the right things now? What would it look like in 20 years? Y'all can go in whatever order you want.
I'll jump in first. I think the field of academia and STEM in particular, which is where I'm embedded, would look more like the rest of the country, more like the rest of the world, and the community in entrepreneurship and venture capital would also look more like the rest of the world, and we would have closed the huge racial and gender wealth gaps.
Yeah, I'll go next. I think for me, it's a matter of, I'll determine success or ultimate success when, when we look at the funding metrics and they're directly proportional to what the gender breakdown, the racial breakdown, and because there's a pretty significant disparity now in regards to like the investment dollars versus, what we look like as a society. So I think that, if we can actually get those numbers, closer or directly proportional to our basic, society dynamics, I think that would be significant success. And I say that with a lot of hope, for, our kids to not, have to deal with some of the things that we've dealt with. I mean, don't get me wrong, we've made progress, but it's been small and we have a long way to go. So my hope is that it would be directly proportional to the traditional or organic gender breakdown of our society, gender and racial breakdown.
I'll retweet what Davion said, and I'll go before we have a Rodney mic drop moment, because that's how I feel like we're going to end. It's just the way that it feels. It's just the vibe I'm getting right now. But similar to what Davion said, I hope that one day demographic data on who is raising capital and who is investing in entrepreneurial ventures is boring. That's my hope. I hope it's really boring because it looks just like the population of the country. So instead, we're having panels that are talking about the problems that the entrepreneurs are actually solving, not the problem that they're having getting the capital to solve the problem. That's what I hope we're talking about in 20 years.
Martha, I after that, you made me feel like I'm like the closing revivalist.
You are, Rodney. Come on, you are.
I gotta bring it.
Hey, Rodney, before you go, you got to do one of these right here.
Oh, you're like that?
For emphasis, right here, and then you can give your statement.
The closing revivalist is also the one that raises the largest offering. To fund the church's annual operations. So, I'm working on this new piece that's actually coming out tomorrow with HRNA advisors. And we were able to aggregate the data that shows that based upon Black and Latinx representation in the US population, right? Just as looking at the US population and what representation looks like, just to get to equality of representation, not equity, but equality of representation, we've got to basically skill and upskill and hire 1.1 million Black and Latinx people. Like, that is a goal, and it's being framed as this like $50 billion racial income gap, right? So that's just income. So to quantify this, in the next 10, 20, 30 years, I'd like to see 1.1 million Black and brown people in the tech ecosystem. Now that's just income and representation. Where I think the wealth happens is when, let's take the 2019 VC numbers, and you look at approximately 11,000 firms that receive capital. When we can point to a year where there are 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 Black and brown firms, and it's like so normalized that nobody can release an article about a Black founder raising capital because why? It doesn't matter, right? And I think when we start to think about both sides of that coin, jobs, skills and jobs, and then startups and capital with access to markets, that's when we actually see the wealth decrease, right? We won't end the wealth gap. You know, this is the sad part of the sermon is we won't end the wealth gap in 20 years, right? It's actually growing. Innovation density is exacerbating it. Add a pandemic, add all the other stuff, it's exacerbating it. So like if we could in 10 to 20 years, like just stop exacerbating it, you know, if we could stop the slide into this abyss where they're projecting by 2053, 0, and now with the pandemic, it's 2043, I think, right? So we've got work to do just to slow it down. And if we can get 1.1 million Black and brown folks into the tech ecosystem, the positive thing about the tech ecosystem and the fourth industrial revolution is that it is not a finite industry. So anyone that, when I say let's get 1 million Black people in the tech ecosystem, it does not mean that we push white people out. It does not mean that we push non-Black people out, right? The ecosystem is ever expanding, that everyone can fit in it. And like this truly rising tide lifts all the boats. The ocean is there. We just got to get more folks with boats and get folks out in the ocean. And so that's what I'm encouraged about. I think conversations like this where we go beyond the performative and kind of like, you know, the acknowledgement of the problem. We did an amazing year last year of acknowledging the problem. We quantified it at Brookings Institution that to upskill 1 million people is about $15 billion, and to fund 10,000 Black startups, Black and brown startups, was 11 billion. $26 billion is the number, and it would be distributed across US cities. Now, a year ago, if I said, you know, if I came on this panel or any conference live in person and said that it's going to cost $26 billion, y'all would have laughed me out of the room. But in the face of multiple trillion-dollar stimulus packages, and now an infrastructure bill that's worth trillions as well, 26 billion just sounds like, you know, a seed round, right? So I think that because our perceptions have changed, and we're thinking bigger about what it's going to cost to actually do this work, that we're starting to, you know, slowly but surely inch toward it. So the doors of the conference are open.
Hey, just finish right here.
Like this? All right.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. There you go. Now you're done. Now you're done.
Nah, but it's so fun working with all of y'all. You know what I mean? I really want to say that publicly and let it be recorded on the record, from government to higher ed to industry to the ecosystem. These are exciting times.
They are. Well, and I want to thank you, all of our panelists, so much. Thank you for the audience hanging in there while we went a little long, but this is just the thing that I'm excited about, is that we've got people at the table and we're starting to see some of that action. We're starting to feel like it's not just a dream, but that there is a pathway, but it does take everyone getting engaged. So speaking of engagement, thank you to our panelists. Thank you to Ashley setting us up. I do want to say that if you want to continue the conversation, we are actually going to be doing some networking sessions. So there's going to be 2 rooms available. Sydney is going to drop the links into the chat as I talk about them. The first one is for the first session today, which was around discussing the content there, which was about financing, disparities in financing, and all of those areas. The second one is the one that we were just talking about. So if you're interested in having more discussions about creating inclusive entrepreneurial ecosystems, join us in the second link that you're going to see. And these are going to be Zoom, so we can have more of a conversation and truly get into the networking. So finally, you know, please join us back here tomorrow at 11 a.m. We're going to be talking about healthcare and innovation, and some more on teams and talent and remote work, and how those 2 things that have really driven things over the past year, how they are impacting things as we move forward. So thank you very much. And I look forward to seeing y'all in one of the 2 networking rooms. Bye.